Ned Stark stands in the godswood at Winterfell, his back against the weirwood's white bark, and watches his king ride south without him. Robert Baratheon came north with an offer, the hand of the king, the second most powerful position in the Seven Kingdoms, and Ned said no. He said no because his son lies broken in a bed 3 stories above. Because the South killed his father and brother and sister, and because a man who listens to the old gods in a northern godswood knows, in the marrow of his bones, that some roads lead only to graves. The realm will burn without him. But the realm is not his family, and Winterfell is not King's Landing, and Eddard Stark has made his choice. The godswood. The boy had not woken. 3 days since the fall, 3 days since Bran's body was found at the base of the broken tower. Crumpled on the stones like a discarded toy, his spine bent at an angle that Maester Luwin's face confirmed was catastrophic before his mouth said the words, and the boy had not opened his eyes. He breathed. His heart beat. His skin was warm, and his pulse was present, and the Maester said that these were signs of life, and that life, while present, could still recover, could still produce a future that contained something other than the bed and the ceiling and the slow diminishment of a boy who would never climb again. Ned sat beside the bed. He had been sitting for hours, long enough that the candles had burned to stubs, and the fire had collapsed into embers, and the light in the room had shifted from the orange of evening to the grey of a northern night that was not dark so much as dim, the permanent twilight of a latitude where the sun never fully committed to absence. Catelyn was asleep in the chair opposite, her hand still wrapped around Bran's, her face carrying the drawn pallor of a mother whose child was broken, and whose grief had exhausted itself into a sleep that was closer to collapse than rest. Robert was downstairs. The king had been in Winterfell for 6 days, 6 days of feasting, drinking, reminiscing about the rebellion, and the careful political courtship that preceded the offer. The offer had been made on the second night, in the crypts, beside Lyanna's statue, with the casual confidence of a king who assumed that his oldest friend would leap at the chance to stand beside him in the capital. "I need you, Ned. Come south. Be my hand." Ned had not answered that night. He had said he would consider it, which was the northern equivalent of a diplomatic delay, and Robert had interpreted it as reluctance that could be overcome rather than hesitation that might harden into refusal. Catelyn had been divided, wanting Ned to stay, recognizing the honor, weighing the political advantages against the personal costs. Maester Luwin had counseled acceptance. Benjen, visiting from the wall, had said nothing, which was its own counsel. And then Bran fell. The fall changed everything, not gradually, not through the accumulated weight of argument and counter-argument, but instantly, the way a river changed course when a dam broke, the water finding a new path, because the old path was blocked by the rubble of a world that had rearranged itself in the time it took a boy to drop from a window. Ned found Robert in the great hall on the morning of the 7th day. The king was eating breakfast with the appetite of a man whose appetites had long ago outgrown his frame. Bread, bacon, eggs, ale. The systematic consumption of food that was fuel for a body that burned too hot and too fast, and that would, in less than a year, burn through the boar's tusk that ended it. But Ned did not know that. No one did. Robert. The king looked up. The assessment was instantaneous. Robert Baratheon, for all his faults, for all the weight and the wine and the whoring, could still read a man's face the way a hunter read tracks, and Ned's face was readable. The king set down his bread. "You're saying no. I'm saying no. Ned, my son is dying. He may already be dead in all the ways that matter. I cannot go south while Bran lies in that bed. Bran will recover, or he won't. Your being here doesn't change that. It changes what kind of father I am." Robert's jaw tightened. The tightening was the first sign of a response that was not acceptance, the muscular prelude to anger, or argument, or the bullish insistence that Robert employed when the world refused to arrange itself according to his expectations. But the anger did not come. Instead, Robert looked at Ned with an expression that was older than their friendship and sadder than the occasion warranted. "I came north for you. A month on the road, A month with the Queen and her family in a wheelhouse that smelled like perfume and contempt. I came because I need someone I trust, and the list of people I trust has exactly one name on it. I know. The last hand died in that city, Ned. Jon Arryn served faithfully for 17 years and died in his bed, and I don't know why, and I don't know who, and I need someone who will find out. Send Stannis. The suggestion landed badly. Robert's face underwent a transformation that moved from surprise through irritation to the flat rejection of a man who would rather leave the position empty than fill it with his brother. Stannis has the personality of a wet stone. The court would revolt inside a month. The small council would stop meeting. Half the lords in the kingdom would start plotting just to have something more interesting to do. Stannis is competent. Stannis is a headache wrapped in a lecture delivered on a rainy day. I need a friend, not a Gowler. Then I'm sorry. Because the friend is staying in Winterfell. The conversation lasted another hour. Robert argued. Ned held firm. The arguments were Robert's standard repertoire: duty, friendship, the realm's need, the debt they owed each other from the war. And each argument struck the wall of Ned's refusal and fell away without purchase. Because the wall was built on the image of a boy in a bed, and no amount of rhetoric could scale it. Robert left Winterfell 3 days later. The departure was cold. Not hostile, not formally ruptured, but cold. The temperature of a friendship that had been asked for something and denied it. The king rode south with his queen and his court and his kingsguard, and the weight of a throne that was consuming him. And Ned stood on the battlements and watched the column shrink into the distance and felt two things: relief, because the south was leaving and taking its dangers with it, and guilt, because the man on the horse at the head of that column was his oldest friend, and the oldest friend was riding towards something that Ned could not name and could not prevent, and that sat in his gut like a stone. Catelyn found him on the battlements. "You did the right thing," she said. "Then why does it feel like a betrayal?" Because Robert made it personal. He always makes it personal. That is his gift and his weapon, and the reason that men follow him into wars they cannot win. But personal is not the same as right. And you are not Robert's hand. You are Bran's father. Ned looked north. The Wolfswood stretched to the horizon. Dark, green, ancient, the forest that had covered this land since the Age of Heroes, and that would cover it long after the Starks and the Baratheons and the Lannisters were dust. The forest did not care about the politics of kings. The forest cared about roots and rain and the slow turning of seasons that no throne could accelerate or delay. "Something is wrong in King's Landing," Ned said. "Jon Arryn is dead. Robert doesn't know why. And the Queen's family, the Lannisters, they're circling him like wolves around a wounded stag. That is Robert's problem now, not yours. It became my problem when someone pushed my son from a tower." The statement hung between them. Catelyn did not challenge it. She had drawn the same inference, following the same thread from Bran's fall to the Lannisters' presence in Winterfell, to the question that neither of them had yet spoken aloud: who pushed Bran, and why? "You think it was them," Catelyn said. "Bran climbed every wall in this castle since he was old enough to grip stone. He never fell. Not once. And he falls on the day the castle is full of strangers, Lannisters, Baratheons, 100 people who were not here last week and who will not be here next week. A boy who has never fallen suddenly falls from the one tower that overlooks the guest chambers. That is not proof." "No, it is not proof. But it is the beginning of a question, and the question will have an answer, and I intend to find it." The dagger in the dark. The assassin came on the 14th night, a man, thin, rough, carrying the look of someone who had been paid for a task, and who intended to complete it with the mechanical efficiency of a tradesman rather than the passion of a true believer. He entered through the library window, which had been left unlatched, because the library was on the second floor, and no one expected an intruder to climb the walls of Winterfell in the middle of the night. The man carried a knife, Valyrian steel, dragonbone hilt, a weapon worth more than everything else the man owned combined, which was the first indication that the man had not supplied the weapon himself. He did not reach Bran. The door to Bran's chamber was guarded by Catelyn, who had resumed her vigil after 3 days of exhausted sleep, and by Summer, who had been brought inside at Rob's insistence because the direwolf was restless, and the restlessness had a quality that Rob, 14, perceptive, already developing the instincts that command would sharpen, found unsettling. The assassin opened the door. Catelyn saw him. She screamed. Not the theatrical scream of a woman in a story, but the raw, animal sound of a mother between a threat and her child. The man moved toward the bed. Summer moved faster. The direwolf killed the assassin in 3 seconds. The sound was brief and wet, and concluded with the man on the floor and the wolf standing over him with blood on its muzzle, and the expression that wolves wore when they had completed a task that their nature demanded and that their satisfaction confirmed. Ned arrived 90 seconds later, barefoot, ice in his hands, the Valyrian greatsword that was too large for indoor combat and that he had grabbed out of reflex rather than reason. He found Catelyn on the floor beside the bed, her hands bloody, cut during the struggle when she had grabbed the assassin's blade to keep it from reaching Bran, and Summer standing guard, and the dead man cooling on the stones. The dagger was recovered. Ned examined it in the light of the solar the next morning, turning it in his hands, while Maester Luwin and Sir Roderick and Catelyn watched. The blade was Valyrian steel, the distinctive dark ripples, the impossible sharpness, the lightness that made ordinary steel feel crude by comparison. The hilt was dragonbone. The combination, Valyrian steel blade, dragonbone handle, was rare, expensive, and identifiable. This was not a common thief's weapon. This was a dagger that belonged to someone wealthy, someone connected, someone whose identity could be traced if the right questions were asked in the right places. Who sends an assassin with a blade this valuable? Ned said. A blade that can be recognized, a blade that points back to its owner. A man who is arrogant, Sir Roderick said. Or a man who is stupid. Or a man who took the weapon from someone else's collection, Luwin added. The blade need not belong to the man who ordered the killing. Catelyn's hands were bandaged, white linen wrapped around palms that had seized a Valyrian edge and paid for it in deep, clean cuts that Luwin had stitched, and that would scar. She sat straight in her chair despite the pain, and the straightness was not composure, but fury held rigid. My sister's letter, Catelyn said. Lisa wrote that Jon Arryn was murdered by the Lannisters, and now someone has sent a killer for our son, who fell from a tower on the day the Lannisters were guests in our home. These are not coincidences. The letter had arrived 2 days before Robert's departure, delivered by a carved wooden box within a box, Lysa Arryn's hand, the cipher that the Tully sisters had used since childhood. The Lannisters murdered my husband. Trust no one. Come to no one's aid. The letter was hysterical in tone and absolute in accusation, and offered no evidence beyond the conviction of a widow whose grief had sharpened into paranoia. But paranoia, as Ned had learned, was sometimes the name that calm people gave to accurate fear. I will not go south, Ned said. I told Robert no, and I meant it. But I cannot ignore this. Someone pushed Bran. Someone sent a killer to finish what the Fall did not. And if Lysa is right, if the Lannisters killed Jon Arryn, then the pattern is not isolated. It is a campaign. What do you propose? Luwin asked. Roderick, you will go to King's Landing. Take the dagger. Show it to people who trade in rare weapons, smiths, collectors, the kind of men who know the provenance of Valyrian steel. Find out who owns it. Find out who handled it. And while you are there, learn what you can about Jon Arryn's death. Who was with him in his last days? What he was investigating? Who benefited from his death? That will take weeks. Roderick said. We have weeks. The Lannisters do not know that we suspect them. They believe Bran's fall was an accident. They believe the assassin was a random lunatic. As long as they believe that, we have time. And if they learn that we are investigating, then we will learn that they have something to hide, which will be its own kind of answer. Roderick departed within 3 days, riding south with a small escort and the dagger wrapped in oilskin beneath his cloak. He carried letters of introduction from Ned to Jon Arryn's former steward to Sir Hugh of the Vale, who had served as Jon's squire. to the armorers and blacksmiths and merchants who dealt in the kind of rare metalwork that produced Valyrian steel daggers with dragonbone hilts. Ned stayed in Winterfell. He sat with Bran, who still had not woken. He trained with Robb in the yard, noting with the pride and melancholy of a father that his eldest son was becoming a swordsman whose skill would soon surpass his own. He counselled Sansa, who was disappointed that the royal visit had ended without the betrothal she had been dreaming of, the Golden Prince, the Southern Court, the life of a queen, and whose disappointment manifested as a sullen withdrawal that Ned handled with patience and Catelyn handled with sympathy, and that would, in time, fade into the background noise of adolescence. He watched Arya practice with Needle, the slender sword that Jon had given her before leaving for the Wall, a gift that was simultaneously a weapon and a statement of the bond between a bastard brother and a wild sister. Jon had departed with Benjen 3 days before Robert, riding north to Castle Black, and Ned had let him go with the familiar. Corrosive guilt of a man who knew the truth about a boy's parentage and who had chosen silence over revelation. The weeks passed. Winterfell settled into the routine that castles adopted when the excitement was over and the ordinary business of lordship resumed. Harvests, disputes, construction, training, the administrative machinery of a territory that was larger than the other 6 kingdoms combined, and that required constant attention from a lord who took the responsibility seriously. And the investigation continued, invisibly, through letters and agents and the patient accumulation of fragments that would, eventually, assemble into a picture that Ned did not yet know he was building. Anne. Sir Roderick's first letter arrived 6 weeks after his departure. The journey south had been uneventful. The King's Road was safe, the inns were adequate, the only complication a rainstorm in the neck that turned the road to mud and added 3 days to the crossing. Roderick had reached King's Landing, had established himself in a modest inn near the Street of Steel, and had begun the work that Ned had assigned. The dagger, he wrote, had been identified. Not by the smiths. Valyrian steel was ancient, reforged rather than smelted, and the smiths could identify the metal, but not the maker. By a collector. A man named Tobho Mott, the finest armourer on the Street of Steel, who recognized the dragonbone hilt as the work of a Cohoric craftsman, whose pieces were sold exclusively to the wealthiest clients in the 7 kingdoms. The dagger, Mott said, had been part of Robert Baratheon's personal collection. Won in a bet or given as a gift, the provenance unclear because Robert's collection was vast and his record-keeping non-existent. Robert's dagger. The revelation was a complication rather than a solution. Because Robert had not sent the assassin, that much was obvious. The king had no motive and no malice toward Bran, which meant the dagger had been taken from Robert's collection by someone with access. Someone in the Red Keep. Someone close enough to the king to rummage through his belongings without raising alarm. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later. Roderick had been asking about Jon Arryn. The former hand, in his last weeks, had been visiting Robert's bastard children, a baby girl in a village outside the city, a boy apprenticed to Tobho Mott, others scattered across King's Landing and the Crownlands. Jon Arryn had been obsessive about the visits, dragging Stannis Baratheon with him on at least one occasion, studying the children with an intensity that his household found puzzling and that his enemies, if enemies he had, might have found threatening. The children were black of hair. All of them. Every bastard Robert had fathered, and there were many, because Robert's appetites produced children the way storms produced rain. Frequently and indiscriminately had the Baratheon colouring. Black hair, blue eyes, the strong jaw and broad build that the Baratheon bloodline stamped on its offspring with the consistency of a royal mint. Ned read the letter twice. Then he went to the library. The library at Winterfell was modest by southern standards, a single room of shelved volumes, scrolls, and bound manuscripts that Maester Luwin maintained with the dedication of a man who believed that knowledge was the foundation of governance. Ned was not a scholar. He read when duty required and avoided it when duty did not. But the letter from Roderick had sparked a question, and the question required a book, and the book was a heavy leather-bound volume titled The Lineages and Histories of the Great Houses of the 7 Kingdoms. He found the Baratheon entries. Every recorded Baratheon marriage, every recorded Baratheon child, stretching back 300 years. The hair color was noted, black, in every generation, in every marriage, regardless of the bride's coloring. Baratheons married Targaryens and produced black-haired children. Baratheons married Lannisters and produced black-haired children. Baratheons married Estemonts and Penroses and Swans, and the children were black-haired. Every one. The Baratheon seed overwriting the mother's contribution with the stubborn genetic dominance that the maesters called strong blood. Robert's legitimate children were golden-haired, all three of them. Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, golden hair, green eyes, fine features that owed nothing to Robert's build and everything to Cersei's beauty. 3 children who looked like Lannisters and nothing like Baratheons, born to a Baratheon king whose bastards, every one, looked exactly like him. Ned closed the book. He did not need to finish the sentence that the evidence was constructing. Because the sentence was simple and its implications were monstrous, Robert's children were not Robert's children. He told Catelyn that evening, in their chamber, with the door barred and the shutters closed, and the conversation held in voices low enough that the walls could not carry them. "You're certain," Catelyn said. "The evidence is not proof. But it is the evidence that Jon Arryn was gathering when he died, and the evidence that someone killed him to suppress, and the evidence that makes Bran's fall and the assassin's knife into parts of a single design. Someone wanted this secret kept. Someone is willing to kill for it. If the children are not Robert's, if they are Lannister children, then Joffrey is not the heir. Joffrey is a bastard. A bastard born of incest between the Queen and her brother." The words landed in the room like stones dropped from height. Catelyn absorbed them, the trained composure of a woman who had been raised in Riverrun, where composure was a survival skill, processing the implications with the speed and precision that her upbringing demanded. If this is true, then Stannis is the heir. After Robert, yes. And if this becomes known, if anyone proves it, the Lannisters lose everything. The throne, the regency, the power they have built. Everything. Which is why they are willing to kill. Jon Arryn discovered the truth and died for it. Bran saw something, Jaime with the Queen perhaps, in that tower, and was pushed for it. The assassin was sent to finish the silence. "What do you intend to do?" Ned was silent. The silence was not indecision. It was the weighted pause of a man who saw the road ahead and recognized that every path was treacherous. "Tell Robert." The king would demand proof, and the proof was circumstantial, and the accusation against the Queen would tear the realm apart. Stay silent, the secret would fester, the Lannisters would continue to consolidate power, and the day Robert died, from age or accident or the Queen's impatience, a bastard born of incest would sit the Iron Throne. "I will write to Robert," Ned said. "I owe him that. And I will write to Stannis. Because Stannis was investigating with Jon Arryn, and Stannis deserves to know what we have found. A letter accusing the Queen of incest and the heirs of bastardy, sent by Raven. Readable by any maester in any castle the bird might stop at. Not by Raven, by Ryder. A trusted man. Sealed letters, delivered by hand. And if Robert doesn't believe it, then I will have done what honor requires, and the consequences will be Robert's to manage. Honor. The word carried a charge in Catelyn's voice. Not contempt, not quite, but the weariness of a woman who had watched her husband navigate by honor for 15 years, and who had observed that honor was an excellent compass and a terrible shield. Honor is what nearly took you south, Ned. Honor is what Robert used to try to drag you from your family. And now honor is sending a letter that will either be ignored or will start a war. If the letter is ignored, I have fulfilled my obligation. If it starts a war, the war was coming regardless. The truth does not wait for convenient timing. The truth waited for Jon Arryn and killed him. The exchange ended without resolution. Ned wrote the letters, one to Robert, sealed with the direwolf, delivered by Jory Castle, his most trusted captain, one to Stannis, sealed with wax and wrapped in oilskin, delivered by a second rider who travelled by a different route. Both letters contained the same information, the evidence that Jon Arryn had gathered, the evidence that Roderick had confirmed, and the conclusion that the evidence demanded. The letters went south. The riders rode through the neck, through the riverlands, toward a capital and a fortress where the recipients would read the words and make decisions that Ned could not influence and could not control, and that would determine whether the realm that Robert had built was worth the cost of the truth that was about to destroy it. Ned waited. He governed Winterfell, trained his sons, sat with his broken boy, and waited for the answers that would come by rider or by raven, and that would tell him whether the truth had found purchase or whether it had been buried, again, under the weight of power and convenience, and the familiar cowardice that allowed men to ignore uncomfortable facts, because acknowledging them required uncomfortable action. Bran woke. The waking was not dramatic, not the sudden, gasping return to consciousness that stories described, but a gradual surfacing, the slow emergence of awareness through the layers of coma. His eyes opened. They found the ceiling. They moved, left, right, tracking the room, the furniture, the light from the window. And then they found Catelyn, who was beside the bed. And the eyes filled with the confused recognition of a child who had been away and was now back, and who did not understand where he had been. Mother, the word, broke Catelyn open. The composure, the strength, the rigid discipline that had held her together through weeks of vigil, all of it dissolved in the single syllable. And she was crying and holding her son and calling for the maester, and the household was erupting with the news that the boy was awake. Bran was awake. But Bran could not feel his legs. Maester Luwin confirmed what the fall had promised. The spine was damaged, the connection between the brain and the lower body severed, the condition permanent. Bran would live. Bran would think, and speak, and eat, and laugh, and cry, and grow, and learn. Bran would not walk. Bran would not run. Bran would not climb. The cruel irony of a boy who had lived in the sky being confined to the earth. Ned sat with his son the evening of the diagnosis. Bran was propped on pillows, small and pale and looking simultaneously older and younger than his 7 years. Older because suffering aged. Younger because vulnerability shrank. "I remember," Bran said. "What do you remember?" "The tower. I climbed the broken tower. There were people. A man and a woman. The man saw me. He pushed me." Ned's hands clenched. The movement was involuntary, the reflex of a man whose rage was physical, whose anger lived in his muscles rather than his voice, and whose control over that anger was the product of decades of discipline rather than temperament. The man. Did you see his face? Golden hair. He had golden hair. Jaime Lannister. The Kingslayer, the knight who had broken his oath to his king, who had murdered the Mad King in the throne room, who had pushed a 7-year-old boy from a tower because the boy had seen what the knight did not want seen. Ned had suspected. Now Ned knew. "You are safe," Ned said. His voice was steady, the voice of a father reassuring a child, the voice that concealed the storm underneath. "No one will hurt you again. You have my word." The word of Ned Stark was not an empty comfort. It was a commitment, backed by the walls of Winterfell, by the swords of the north, by the direwolves that guarded his children, and by the gathering evidence that would, when the time was right, bring the Lannisters to account for what they had done to a boy who had climbed a tower and found a secret that was worth more than his life. The reply from Stannis arrived by rider 7 weeks after Ned's letter had been sent. The letter was Stannis, terse, unadorned, written in a hand that formed each word with the deliberate precision of a man who considered excess language a moral failing. Stannis confirmed everything. He and Jon Arryn had investigated together. The bastards, the hair, the genealogies. The conclusion was identical to Ned's. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were Jaime Lannister's children, not Robert's. Stannis had withdrawn to Dragonstone after Jon Arryn's death because he feared for his life, and because telling Robert the truth without proof would have resulted in Robert killing the messenger rather than confronting the message. Stannis wrote one additional sentence that Ned read 3 times. "When the time comes, I will need your support. The North's support. Be ready." The letter from Robert did not come. Weeks passed. Then, a month. Jory Castle returned to Winterfell, having delivered the letter to the Red Keepsgate steward and having received no response, and having observed, in the 3 days he spent in King's Landing before riding north, that the capital was unchanged, the court was functioning, the king was hunting, and the Lannisters were everywhere. Robert had either not read the letter, not believed it, or chosen not to respond. Any of the three was possible. All of them were dangerous. Ooh. The king is dead. Robert Baratheon died on a hunting trip in the Kingswood, gored by a boar whose tusks found the gap between the king's ribs that his wine-soaked reflexes could not close. The official account was accident. A boar, a hunt, a king whose appetites had outpaced his abilities. The unofficial account, which circulated in whispers through the capital's taverns and eventually reached the north through the mouths of travelling merchants, was darker. The wine had been fortified. The squire who poured it was a Lannister cousin, and the king's hunting companions had been strangely slow to intervene when the boar charged. The raven arrived at Winterfell carrying 2 scrolls, one bearing the royal seal and the language of official notification, the other bearing Varys's mark, written in a cipher that Ned's maester could not decode, and that Ned decoded himself, using a key that Stannis had provided in his earlier correspondence. The official scroll announced the king's death and Joffrey's ascension. Varys's scroll was shorter. The queen controls the throne. Stannis will move soon. The boy king is Lannister in all but name. Ned read both scrolls in his solar and then sat in the chair behind his desk, the desk where he had governed the North for 15 years, where he had dispensed justice and managed harvests and settled disputes between lords whose grievances were older than their grandparents, and he said nothing for a long time. The grief was not theatrical. It was internal, structural, the grief of a man who had lost a part of his own past, because Robert was not merely a friend, but a chapter of Ned's life, the rebellion, the war, the shared youth that had forged a bond between 2 men who were nothing alike and who loved each other because of it rather than despite it. "I should have gone south," Ned said. He said it to the empty room, because the room was empty, and the statement was the kind of statement that a man made to himself, privately, in the gap between what he had done and what he should have done. If he had gone south, if he had been Hand, if he had been at Robert's side, he might have prevented the hunt. He might have noticed the wine. He might have intercepted the boar or the squire or the queen's scheme, and Robert would be alive, drinking and whoring and running the kingdom into debt, alive. But Ned had not gone south. He had stayed in Winterfell. He had stayed for Bran, and the staying had been right, and the rightness of the staying did not diminish the cost of the staying. And the cost was a friend dead in the Kingswood with a boar's tusk in his belly, and no one beside him who cared enough to save him. Catelyn found him an hour later. She read both scrolls and drew the immediate conclusion. If Joffrey is on the throne, then the truth about his parentage is the most dangerous secret in the realm, and we are among the very few who possess it. Stannis will declare. He has been waiting for this. Stannis declaring is a war against the Iron Throne, against the Lannisters, against the combined resources of the Westerlands and the capital, a war for the lawful succession. Stannis is Robert's heir. The law is clear. The law is clear. The armies are not. Stannis has Dragonstone and a modest fleet. The Lannisters have the Westerlands, the gold, and the throne. If this becomes a war, it will not be won by law. It will be won by swords. She was right. The law could proclaim Stannis king from every sept in the realm, and the proclamation would mean nothing if the swords stood with the Lannisters. Justice without force was philosophy. Force without justice was tyranny. The resolution required both, and the assembly of both required time and allies and the willingness to march. The declarations came within a fortnight. Stannis from Dragonstone, his letter bearing the signature of the Lord of Storm's End and claimant to the Iron Throne, accompanied by a detailed accusation of incest against Cersei and Jaime, and a detailed genealogical argument that the royal children were bastards without claim. Renly from Storm's End, the younger brother, the charming one, the Baratheon who had the Tyrell army behind him and the ambition in front of him, declaring himself king on the basis of nothing except strength and popular support, and the argument that capability mattered more than birth order. Two Baratheon brothers, both claiming the throne. The Lannisters holding the capital with a boy king whose legitimacy depended on a lie. And Ned Stark in Winterfell, holding the truth like a weapon and the North like a shield, deciding what to do with both. The North answers. The Northern Lords came to Winterfell unbidden. They came because the Ravens had carried the news of Robert's death, and Stannis' declaration and Renly's declaration, and the Northern Lords, who were many things, but never politically disengaged, recognized that the succession crisis was not a southern problem that could be observed from a distance, but a continental earthquake whose tremors would reach every holdfast and every harvest and every family oath in the Seven Kingdoms. The Greatjon arrived first, because the Greatjon was always first when the prospect of violence was in the air. He rode through Winterfell's gates with 50 men at arms and the expression of a man who had been waiting 15 years for someone to give him a reason to draw his sword. Lord Stark followed, grim, capable, bringing 300 men and 2 sons whose eagerness for combat was inherited and whose training was sufficient. Maege Mormont came from Bear Island with her daughters and 100 warriors. Roose Bolton came from the Dreadfort with 600 men and the measured silence of a man who committed to nothing until the odds were clear. Ned convened a council in the Great Hall. The hall was full. Lords, captains, castellans, the assembled military leadership of a kingdom that fielded 20,000 swords and that had not fought a war since the Greyjoy Rebellion 9 years ago. The mood was charged, not with fear, but with the aggressive anticipation that Northerners brought to the prospect of marching south. The collective memory of a kingdom that had followed a Stark into war before and had won. "Robert is dead," Ned said. He stood at the head of the table, not the high seat, the table, because this was a council of war, and the symbolism of standing among his lords, rather than above them, was deliberate. His heir by law is Stannis Baratheon. Stannis has declared for the throne. I have evidence. Evidence gathered over months, confirmed by Stannis himself, that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are not Robert's children. They are the products of an incestuous relationship between Cersei and Jaime Lannister. Joffrey is a bastard sitting a throne he has no right to. The hall absorbed the statement. The Greatjon's face contorted through surprise into fury. Karstark's face remained still. Bolton's face was unreadable. Maege Mormont cursed. Wyman Manderley, who had arrived from White Harbour that morning with a considerable retinue and a wheezing chest, paled visibly. "You're certain of this?" Manderley asked. "I am. Jon Arryn discovered the truth and was murdered for it. My son Bran was pushed from a tower by Jaime Lannister because Bran witnessed Jaime and Cersei together. An assassin was sent to finish Bran in his bed. The Lannisters have killed, maimed, and conspired to protect this secret, and the secret is the foundation of a regime that is illegitimate from crown to roots. Then we march south and put Stannis on the throne," the Greatjon said. The statement was delivered with the umber simplicity that treated war as a straightforward problem with a straightforward solution. "Go there, fight those people, win. It is not that simple," Ned said. "Stannis holds Dragonstone with a modest fleet and a smaller army. Renly holds Storm's End with the Tyrells behind him, 60,000 men, the largest army in Westeros. The Lannisters hold the capital with the gold of the Westerlands and the infrastructure of the crown. And Renly has declared for himself, not for Stannis, which means the anti-Lannister forces are divided before the war begins. Let them sort it out amongst themselves," Bolton said. His voice was soft, measured, the voice of a man who calculated costs before commitments. The North has no obligation to fight the South's wars. Stannis and Renly and the Lannisters can bleed each other white. We sit behind the neck and let them. The North has an obligation to the law, Ned replied. Stannis is the lawful king. We swore oaths to Robert's line. Those oaths bind us to Robert's heir. and Robert's heir is Stannis. Oaths to Robert's line, Bolton repeated. Robert is dead. The line is disputed. The oaths were sworn to a throne that may not exist in a year. You are asking us to march 20,000 men 1,000 miles south to fight for a man whose temperament makes him unpopular and whose army makes him weak. I am asking you to honor the law. The law doesn't stop arrows. The debate lasted 3 hours. The Greatjon and the Starks argued for immediate war, march south, fight the Lannisters, put Stannis on the throne, come home. Bolton argued for neutrality. Let the south burn, protect the north, wait for the outcome. Manderley argued for caution, support Stannis with supplies and gold but not men, contribute to the war effort without committing northern lives. Mage Mormont argued for whatever Ned decided, because the Mormonts followed the Starks with the unquestioning loyalty of a house whose bond to Winterfell was older than the arguments against it. Ned listened. He listened to every argument, weighed every position, and made his decision not from the arguments, but from the principle that underlay them, the principle that oaths were not conditional. That law was not negotiable, and that the man who held the North owed the realm more than the North's silence when the realm's foundations were being shattered. We march, Ned said. The North answers when called. Stannis is the lawful king, and the lawful king has asked for our support. I will lead the army myself. The hall reacted. The Greatjon roared approval. Karstark nodded. Bolton said nothing, which was its own statement. Manderley sighed and ordered his captains to prepare. Ned turned to Robb, his eldest son, 15, tall, auburn-haired, carrying the Tully colouring and the Stark resolve in a combination that made him look like a young lord from a song, stood at the edge of the council with Grey Wind beside him, and the expression of a boy who wanted to ride south and fight. You are not coming, Ned said. Father, you are the heir to Winterfell. If I fall in the south, the north needs a Stark to lead it. You will remain here, as acting Lord of Winterfell, with Maester Luwin as advisor and your mother as counsel. I am old enough to fight. You are old enough to govern. Governing is harder. The order was absolute. Robb accepted it with the resentful obedience of a boy who recognized his father's authority, and who would spend the war in Winterfell, governing, training, growing into the lord he would need to become if the war consumed the lord who preceded him. Catelyn had her own argument. You are riding south to fight for another man's throne, she said. They were in their chambers, the night before the army's departure, the candles burning low and the fire casting shadows that moved like restless ghosts. You are riding south to do the thing you refused to do 6 months ago. Leave your family, leave Winterfell, leave the north. 6 months ago, Robert asked me to investigate. Now Stannis asks me to fight. The situations are different. The risk is the same. You leaving, you dying, the children growing up without their father. If I do not go, the Lannisters win. A bastard rules the 7 kingdoms. The man who pushed our son from a tower remains free. And the next time a Lannister comes to Winterfell, and they will come, Cat, if they win this war, there will be no Robert to restrain them. We will be subjects of Joffrey Baratheon, who is Jaime's son, and Jaime threw Bran from a window. And how long do you think Jaime's son will tolerate a Stark who knows the truth about his parentage? Catelyn was silent. The argument was sound, not merely emotional, not merely honourable, but strategically accurate. The Starks' knowledge of the Lannister secret made them a threat that the Lannisters could not tolerate indefinitely. Neutrality was not safety. Neutrality was a delay. Then go, she said. Win and come home. The march. The Northern Army assembled at Winterfell over 3 weeks and marched south with 18,000 men. The number was smaller than the full Northern Levy. 25,000 was the theoretical maximum, because Ned left garrisons. 2,000 at Winterfell under Robb. 1,000 distributed along the western coast against the possibility of Ironborn raiders. 500 at Moat Cailin to hold the neck. The reductions were the calculations of a man who had fought one war and who understood that armies marching south left territories exposed, and that exposed territories attracted opportunists. Ned rode at the column's head. He was 40, Old for a first campaign in 15 years, young enough that the riding did not pain him, and the sword still felt natural in his hand. Ice hung across his back, the Valyrian greatsword of House Stark. Too long and heavy for mounted combat, but essential as a symbol. The physical embodiment of Stark authority that the Northern Lords recognized, and that the enemies ahead would learn to. The march south took 2 weeks through the north, the King's Road stretching endlessly through the Wolfswood, past Cerwyn, past the Barrowlands. Into the marshes of the Neck, where the road narrowed, and the swamps pressed close, and the Crannogman watched from the reeds with the silent, calculating observation of a people who had been guarding the north-southern border since before the Andals arrived. Howland Reed met Ned at the causeway through the Neck. The Lord of Greywater Watch was small, quiet, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of man who disappeared into a crowd of 3 and whose presence was felt rather than seen. Howland had ridden with Ned at the Tower of Joy. He was one of 2 survivors of that fight, and the bond between them was the bond of men who had bled together and who shared a secret that neither had ever spoken of to anyone else. Crannogman will hold the Neck, Howland said. No southern army will cross while I live. The North's back is protected. Thank you, old friend. Be careful in the south, Ned. Southern wars are not northern wars. The enemies fight with paper and poison as often as with steel. I know. You know, and you will forget. Because you are Ned Stark. And forgetting is what you do when honor tells you that the enemy will fight fairly. The observation was more accurate than Ned cared to admit. He clasped Howland's hand and rode south, and behind him the Neck closed like a gate. The twins rose from the Green Fork on the 21st day of the march. Walder Frey's castle squatted on both banks, joined by the bridge that was the only crossing for 100 miles. And the toll that the crossing demanded was the price of a lord whose leverage was geographical rather than military. Ned did not negotiate. He rode to the gate of the eastern castle with an escort of 20 men, the Greatjon, Karstark, Glover, senior captains, whose presence communicated that this was not a petition, but a consultation. And he sent word to Lord Frey that the Warden of the North required passage for the king's army. Walder Frey received them in his hall. The old lord was propped in his chair, surrounded by the genetic sprawl of his 90 years of prolific fathering, and his watery eyes assessed Ned with the calculation of a man who had been weighing the value of visitors since before Ned was born. The Warden of the North, Frey said, riding south for the 2nd time in my memory. Last time you came back with a new king. What do you bring back this time, I wonder? Last time, Lord Frey, you arrived at the Trident after the battle was won. I hope your timing has improved. The hall went still. Walder Frey's late arrival at the Battle of the Trident, the calculated delay that had allowed him to join the winning side only after the winning side had been determined, was the old lord's deepest humiliation, the wound that 15 years of lordly pretension had not healed. Ned invoked it with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that shame was a weapon, and that the weapon was justified when the target was obstruction. You dare. I dare, because time is short, and courtesy is a luxury that my soldiers' lives cannot afford. I am marching south to support Stannis Baratheon, the lawful king of the 7 kingdoms, against a bastard on the Iron Throne. The North marches. The Riverlands, your liege lord's territory, is threatened by Lannister forces. Your bridge is the crossing that my army requires. I am not asking for your support, Lord Frey. I am offering you the opportunity to provide it. And if I decline, then I will ford the river 30 miles upstream, and the Northern army will remember that the Lord of the Crossing closed his gates when the Warden of the North asked for passage. And when the war is won, and it will be won, the memory will be long. Frey's tongue moved across his lower lip. The old man's calculations were visible. The mathematics of allegiance, the probability of Ned's victory, the cost of refusal against the cost of compliance. Ned was not Robb. Ned was not a boy of 15 whose desperation could be exploited. Ned was the most respected lord in the North, a veteran of Robert's rebellion, and a man whose word was law in a territory larger than the other 6 kingdoms combined. Refusing Ned Stark was a different calculation than refusing a boy. I want a marriage, Frey said. My granddaughter Roslyn. You will receive a formal alliance. House Stark will recognize House Frey's loyalty and support your petition for a seat on the Riverlands Council when the war is concluded. Your grandson Oliver will serve as my personal squire for the duration of the campaign. Those are my terms. Marriage is a conversation for peacetime. These are wartime terms, and they are generous. Frey stared at Ned. The stare was the stare of a man who had been outmaneuvered by directness, a weapon that Walder Frey, whose entire life was built on indirectness, had no effective counter against. The old lord could refuse. But refusing the Warden of the North, on behalf of the lawful king, while Lannister armies threatened the Riverlands that Frey technically owed service to, the calculation produced only one viable answer. My bridge is yours, Frey said, and I will remember your terms, Lord Stark. Every word. The threat was implicit. The compliance was immediate. The army crossed the bridge in a column that took 8 hours to pass, and when the last man was across, Ned stood on the western bank and looked south toward the Riverlands, where Tywin Lannister's outriders had already been reported burning villages along the Red Fork, and where the war that Ned had hoped to prevent from Winterfell was now waiting for him to fight it in person. Edmure Tully met Ned 3 days south of the Twins. Catelyn's brother was young, eager, and overwhelmed, the acting Lord of Riverrun, while his father, Hoster Tully, lay dying in his chambers, and the commander of a Riverlands force that was outmatched by the Lannister army that had crossed the border and begun the systematic devastation that Tywin employed as both strategy and statement. They burned the Mummers Ford, Edmure said. His voice was raw with the frustration of a man who had watched his lands ravaged and who lacked the forces to stop it. Gregor Clegane leads the raiders. The mountain, he's burning everything between the Red Fork and the Gold Road. Small folk are fleeing north. The villages are ash. How many men does Tywin have? 30,000. Perhaps more. They crossed at the Golden Tooth 2 weeks ago. The main force is moving toward Harrenhal. Clegane's raiders are screening the advance and burning as they go. 30,000. Ned had 18. The disparity was significant, not decisive, because northern soldiers were hardened and well-trained, and fighting for a cause that the Lannister conscripts did not share. But significant enough that a direct engagement on open ground would be costly. Where is Stannis? Ned asked. Dragonstone. He has his fleet, but hasn't moved. He's waiting. For what? For you, my lord. For someone to draw Tywin west so Stannis can strike east. He sent word through his castellan. He plans to take King's Landing by sea while the Lannister army is engaged in the field. The strategy was sound and ruthless. Stannis was using the northern army as a hammer and himself as a knife. Ned would fight Tywin in the Riverlands, pinning the Lannister forces in the field, while Stannis sailed his fleet up Blackwater Bay and took the capital. If both operations succeeded, the Lannisters would lose their army and their throne simultaneously. If both operations succeeded, the conditional was the wait. We march to Riverrun, Ned said. Consolidate the Riverlands forces with ours. Secure the castle as a base. And then we deal with Tywin. The Peacemaker. The Ravens went to Dragonstone and Storm's End on the same day, carrying the same message. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, proposed a parley between the brothers Baratheon to discuss the succession and the war and the future of the Seven Kingdoms. The parley would be held at Storm's End. Ned would attend in person. He guaranteed the safety of both parties under his own honor. Stannis' reply arrived first. The letter was Stannis, curt, unadorned, grudgingly cooperative. I will attend. I will hear what Stark has to say. I will not bend to my brother's pretensions. The conditional cooperation of a man who believed the law was on his side and who consented to diplomacy only because the man proposing it was one of the few people in the realm whose judgment Stannis respected. Renly's reply was warmer and less committal. Lord Stark is always welcome at Storm's End. I would be delighted to discuss the future of the realm with my brother and with the Warden of the North. I look forward to hearing your perspective on who should sit the Iron Throne. The warmth was real. Renly liked Ned, admired the Stark reputation, and was shrewd enough to recognize that the North's support would strengthen any claim. The non-commitment was also real. Renly had no intention of yielding his claim unless the yielding produced an advantage. Ned left the army at River Run under joint command, Edmure Tully holding the castle, the Griachon commanding the northern forces in the field, with instructions to hold defensive positions along the Red Fork and to avoid engaging Tywin's main force until Ned returned. The instructions were Ned's, the strategy of a man who understood that an army without its commander fought differently than an army with him, and that the difference could be fatal. He rode south with 100 men, a mounted escort, fast-moving, taking the roads through the stormlands that skirted the Reach and avoided Lannister-held territory. The ride took 12 days, and the countryside they passed through told the story of a realm fracturing. Villages emptied by rumor, bridges guarded by nervous soldiers wearing sigils that changed every 50 miles. The general displacement of a civilian population that recognized the signs of approaching war and was moving away from the epicenter. Storm's End was a fortress that justified its name, massive, ancient, built from a stone so dark it looked black in the rain that was falling when Ned arrived. The castle sat on a headland above Shipbreaker Bay. Its walls curved against the storms that hammered the coast and that had, according to legend, been tamed only by the magic that Duran Godsgrief had woven into the foundations 10,000 years ago. The castle was impregnable. It had held against a year-long siege during Robert's rebellion, Stannis' siege, Stannis' starvation. Stannis' grinding refusal to surrender despite every logical reason to do so, and the scars of that siege were invisible on the stone, but visible on the man who had endured it. Renly received Ned in the Great Hall with the hospitality that was his gift, food, wine, fire, dry clothes, and the easy charm of a man who turned every interaction into an occasion. Renly Baratheon at 21 was everything Robert had been at 21, and nothing Robert had become at 36. Tall, handsome, athletic, magnetic, with the Baratheon jaw and the Baratheon coloring, and the Baratheon confidence, minus the Baratheon vices. Where Robert drank, Renly socialized. Where Robert whored, Renly cultivated loyalty. Where Robert neglected governance, Renly excelled at it. Lord Stark, you look tired. I've been riding for 12 days through a country that can't decide which king to obey. That's why I'm here. To simplify the decision. Renly smiled. The smile that was his primary diplomatic instrument and that worked on nearly everyone, and that failed entirely on Stannis, which was the core of the problem. Sit, eat. My brother arrives tomorrow with his fleet. Let us enjoy the evening before the arguing begins. Stannis arrived the following morning. His fleet, 30 ships, modest by any standard, anchored in Shipbreaker Bay with the calculated risk of a man who understood that the bay's reputation for destroying ships was earned, and who docked there anyway, because the alternative was a longer journey, and Stannis did not waste time on alternatives when the direct path was available. The Lord of Dragonstone was everything his reputation promised, and nothing his reputation could adequately convey. Stannis Baratheon, at 35, was a man whose face had been carved from the same stone as his castle, hard, angular, set in an expression of permanent disapproval that was not affectation, but the genuine product of a man who found the world consistently disappointing. He was lean where Robert had been massive, rigid where Renly was flexible, and humorless in a way that made every conversation feel like a court proceeding. He brought Melisandre. The Red Woman entered Storm's End like a flame entering a dark room, visible, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. She was tall, beautiful, dressed in red from throat to heel, and she radiated a presence that was not charisma, but something older and more disquieting. The presence of a woman who served a god that the men around her did not worship, and whose service granted her powers that the men around her could not understand. Ned looked at Melisandre and felt the instinctive recoil that Northerners felt in the presence of foreign magic, the old god's warning perhaps, or the simple human response to encountering something that violated the rules by which the world was supposed to operate. "Your priestess," Ned said to Stannis. "Is she here for the negotiation?" "Lady Melisandre advises me. She goes where I go." This is a council of lords, not a religious convocation. She stays. The negotiation began that afternoon in the round hall, the circular chamber at Storm's End's heart, built without corners, because the builders believed that corners harbored evil spirits. Ned sat between the brothers, a physical mediator in a chair that was positioned equidistant from both claimants, the geometry of neutrality made architectural. Stannis spoke first. The law is clear. I am Robert's eldest surviving brother. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are bastards born of incest. The throne is mine by right. The throne belongs to the man who can hold it, Renly said. Robert took it by conquest. The law of conquest says the strongest claim wins. I have 80,000 men. You have 5,000. The arithmetic is simple. Arithmetic is not law. No, but it is reality. And reality, brother, is what determines who sits the throne. Not birth certificates. Lord Stark. Stannis turned to Ned. The turn was a concession. Stannis, who rarely sought others' opinions because he generally considered other opinions inferior to his own, was asking for Ned's judgment. The asking was a measure of Ned's reputation. You have investigated the truth of Joffrey's parentage. You know the law. Tell my brother who is right. Ned considered his words. The consideration was not hesitation. It was the discipline of a man who recognized that careless language in this room could kill thousands of people on battlefields 100 miles away. The law supports Stannis. Robert's legitimate heir is his eldest surviving brother, and the evidence of Joffrey's illegitimacy is conclusive. Stannis is the lawful king. Renly's face did not change. The charm remained in place, the mask that Renly wore so effortlessly that it was indistinguishable from his actual face, but the eyes behind the mask recalculated. Law, Renly said. Lord Stark. I respect your devotion to law. I respect my brother's claim under the law. But law without the strength to enforce it is a document, not a kingdom. Stannis cannot enforce his claim. He has 5,000 men and a fleet and a priestess. I have the Reach, the Stormlands, and the largest army ever assembled in Westeros. If we fight, and if Stannis insists on his claim, we will fight. I will win. Not because I am the better man, but because I have the better army. And after I win, I will still need to fight the Lannisters. How many men die in a war between brothers before we can fight the real enemy? The argument was not without merit. Ned recognized the merit, the strategic logic, the practical assessment of military reality. The acknowledgement that a succession war between Stannis and Renly would weaken both and strengthen the Lannisters. But merit was not the same as right, and the argument's conclusion that Stannis should abandon his lawful claim because Renly had more swords was the kind of reasoning that made inheritance meaningless and power the only currency. There is a middle path, Ned said. Stannis is the elder. The throne is his by law. But Stannis' heir is his daughter, Shireen, who is a child and whose succession would be contested. Renly is the natural alternative. He looked at both brothers. The proposal was forming, the compromise that he had been constructing during 12 days of riding, the political architecture that might bridge the gap between law and power. Stannis takes the throne. Renly is named Prince of Dragonstone and heir to the Iron Throne until such time as Stannis produces a male heir. Renly commands the combined army, Stannis' forces, Renly's forces, the northern forces in the campaign against the Lannisters. The brothers rule as king and heir, with the succession secured and the military command unified. The silence that followed was the silence of men considering a proposal that was not what either wanted and that was better than what either would achieve through war. Stannis spoke first. You propose that I name my brother my heir, over my own daughter. Shireen is a child. The realm needs a proven successor, not a regency waiting to happen. Naming Renly as heir secures the succession and prevents the kind of war that destroyed the Targaryens. You can revisit the succession if you produce a son. And if I don't, then Renly succeeds you, and the Baratheon line continues without the bloodshed that a disputed succession would produce. Stannis' jaw worked. The grinding was audible. the physical manifestation of a man wrestling with a proposal that was logically sound and personally humiliating, because the proposal required him to acknowledge that his line was insufficient and that his brother was necessary. Renly leaned forward. The charm was gone, replaced by genuine interest, the expression of a man who was hearing an offer that was better than war and nearly as good as victory. I would serve as Stannis' heir, command the army, eventually take the throne. Eventually, Ned said, when Stannis dies, or if Stannis abdicates. Not before. And in the meantime, you serve. As Robert served Jon Arryn during the years of peace, as Hand, perhaps, or Master of Laws. A position of authority that uses your talents and prepares you for the throne that will eventually be yours. Renly looked at Stannis. Stannis looked at the table. Melisandre, who had been silent throughout, looked at Ned with an expression that was not hostility but assessment. The assessment of a woman evaluating a man who was attempting to build something that her fires had not predicted, and whose success would alter the path that she had foreseen for her king. I need time, Stannis said, to consider. We don't have time, Ned replied. Every day we negotiate is a day Tywin uses to strengthen his position. Every day the Baratheon forces remain divided is a day the Lannisters win by default. I need an answer, and I need it by morning. Morning. Stannis stood. The standing was deliberate, the motion of a man reclaiming the authority that a seated negotiation diminished. You will have your answer, Lord Stark, and I will make the decision that the realm requires, not the one that my pride demands. The concession, grudging, painful, wrenched from the granite of Stannis' personality, was the closest thing to flexibility that the Lord of Dragonstone had ever produced in Ned's experience. It was not agreement, but it was the absence of refusal, and in Stannis' vocabulary, the absence of refusal was practically enthusiasm. The shadow. The shadow. The shadow came at midnight. Ned did not see it. He was in his chambers, the guest quarters at Storm's End, a room of dark stone and narrow windows that looked out over Shipbreaker Bay, reviewing the terms of the agreement that he intended to finalize in the morning. The terms were drafted on parchment, in Ned's hand, with the precision that legal documents required. Stannis as king, Renly as heir and hand, the army unified under Renly's field command with Stannis' strategic authority, the Northern Alliance formalized. The campaign against the Lannisters to commence within a fortnight. The screaming woke him. Not one scream, many, cascading through the castle like a wave, the sequential alarm of guards and servants and lords in waiting who were discovering something that produced screaming as a reflex rather than a choice. Ned grabbed ice and ran. Renly's chamber was on the second floor, behind a door that was guarded by 2 knights of Renly's personal guard, the Rainbow Guard, their cloaks the 7 colors of the faith, and the guards were not at their posts. One was on the floor, unconscious, struck from behind. The other was standing in the doorway with his sword drawn and his face the color of ash, staring at something inside the room that his training had not prepared him for. Ned pushed past him. Renly was on the floor. The young lord, the charming brother, the popular claimant, the man who had spent the evening laughing and plotting and vibrating with the energy of someone who was 21 years old and about to become the second most powerful man in the 7 kingdoms, was on the floor, on his back, with a wound in his chest that should not have existed. There was no weapon, no attacker, no sign of forced entry. The door had been guarded, the windows were 20 feet above the ground and sealed against the storm, and the room contained nothing except Renly and his blood and the cold. A cold that did not belong to the season. A cold that felt intentional, directed, the residue of something that had been in the room and was now gone. Renly was alive. The wound was deep, a puncture below the left collarbone, through muscle and tissue, bleeding freely, but it had missed the heart, missed by inches. The precision was surgical, as though the attacker had intended to kill and had been deflected by the same chance that governed all violence. The fraction of an inch, the heartbeat's timing, the body's unconscious flinch. Maester Jern reached Renly within minutes. The wound was dressed, the bleeding controlled, the young lord carried to a cot where the maester could work. Renly was pale and breathing in shallow, rapid cycles and speaking in fragments that were coherent enough to convey meaning. "A shadow," Renly said. "A shadow in the room. It looked like Stannis." Ned stood in the corridor outside Renly's chamber and felt the cold that was not weather settle into his bones. A shadow. A shadow that looked like Stannis. A wound delivered by no weapon through a locked door in a guarded castle. The Red Woman's presence at Storm's End, her proximity to Stannis, her foreign god, and her foreign fires. The connections formed themselves with the terrible logic of evidence that pointed in a direction that Ned's rational mind did not want to follow, and that his instincts could not ignore. He found Stannis in the Lord's Solar. Stannis was awake, dressed, composed, seated behind the desk with Melisandre standing behind him, her red robes catching the firelight, and her red eyes, not the eyes themselves, which were dark, but the reflected light that gave them a crimson cast, fixed on Ned with the steady regard of a woman who expected the confrontation that was about to occur. "Your brother has been attacked," Ned said. "I am aware." In a sealed room, by something that left no weapon and no trace. Something that Renly describes as a shadow bearing your likeness. Stannis did not flinch. The non-flinch was damning, not because it proved guilt, but because it demonstrated the absence of surprise. And the absence of surprise in a man whose brother had just been stabbed by a supernatural entity was an admission that did not require words. "What did you do?" Ned asked. "I did nothing." "Stannis, the Lord of Light acts through his servants," Melisandre said. Her voice was smooth, certain, carrying the absolute conviction of a true believer who interpreted events as confirmations rather than consequences. "The king's enemies are the Lord's enemies. The night is dark and full of terrors. A man nearly died in his bed. If this is your God's work, then your God is a murderer. The Lord acts in ways that, enough." Ned turned to Stannis. "Did you know this would happen?" The question hung between them. Stannis's face, which was constructed to conceal emotion the way a fortress was constructed to conceal defenders, showed nothing. But the nothing was eloquent. The nothing of a man who had been asked a question whose honest answer would destroy the alliance that had been negotiated that afternoon, and whose dishonest answer would betray the principle that Stannis held above all others. "I knew that Melisandre intended to act," Stannis said. The admission was ground glass, each word scraped from a man whose commitment to honesty was as absolute as his commitment to his claim. "I did not order it. I did not sanction it. But I knew. And I did not prevent it. You knew. And you let it happen. I believed it would resolve the succession without bloodshed. Renly would die. His army would come to me. The war would be shortened by months and thousands of lives. And instead, Renly lives. And the alliance that would have ended the war without a battle between brothers is shattered. Your priestess's god is not only a murderer, he is an incompetent one." Stannis's jaw clenched. The insult struck. Stannis had no attachment to Melisandre's god. But the word incompetent was a word that Stannis could not tolerate being associated with anything he was involved in. The alliance. The alliance is destroyed. Renly will not serve a brother who tried to kill him in his sleep. The Tyrells will not follow a king whose methods include shadow assassins. You had a kingdom within your grasp this afternoon, Stannis, a united front. The Baratheons and the Starks and the Tyrells against the Lannisters. It was there. It was real. And your priestess burned it to ash. Ned turned and left the Solar. Behind him, Stannis said nothing. Melisandre said nothing. The fire crackled and popped, and the shadows on the wall moved in patterns that were shaped by the flames and that seemed, to the guards outside the door, to move independently of the light that cast them. Renly survived the night. By morning, the wound was closed, and the bleeding had stopped, and the young lord was conscious enough to be furious, the cold, precise fury of a man who had been betrayed by blood, and who intended the betrayal to have consequences. "I will destroy him." Renly said. He was propped in his bed, pale but alert, his voice carrying the hardness that injury and betrayal produced when they combined in a man whose charm was a weapon and whose anger was its edge. Stannis tried to kill me. In my own castle. Under a parley flag. With shadow magic and foreign sorcery. Whatever agreement Lord Stark proposed is void. Stannis is not my king. Stannis is my enemy. Ned stood at the foot of the bed. He was exhausted, the exhaustion of a man who had spent 12 days riding to broker a peace that had been destroyed in 12 seconds by a shadow that he could not fight, and a god he did not worship, and a woman whose power operated outside the rules that governed the world Ned knew. Renly, Stannis did not order the attack. His witch did it. His witch, acting in his name, wearing his face. The distinction between ordering and permitting is legal. The wound in my chest is not. If you declare war on Stannis, the Lannisters win. The anti-Lannister forces split. Tywin sits in Harrenhal and watches the Baratheon brothers bleed each other while his position strengthens. The only people who benefit from a war between you and Stannis are Cersei and Tywin and the bastard on the Iron Throne. Then, Stannis should have thought of that before he sent his shadow. Ned had no answer. The argument was correct. Stannis bore responsibility for Melisandre's action, and the action had destroyed the trust that the alliance required. The peace that Ned had constructed, painstakingly, patiently, riding 12 days to build and proposing terms that balanced law and practicality, was rubble. And the rubble could not be rebuilt, because trust, once broken, did not reform on demand. He left Storm's End that afternoon. Stannis departed for Dragonstone an hour later, his fleet cutting through the grey water of Shipbreaker Bay with the rigid precision that characterized everything Stannis did, and that concealed, beneath the precision, the knowledge that his own choices had narrowed his path. Renly sent ravens. The ravens went to every lord in the Reach and the Stormlands. Stannis Baratheon attempted to assassinate me. By shadow magic. Under a parley flag. He is no king. He is a kinslayer who uses sorcery instead of steel. Stand with me against this butcher and his foreign witch. The Tyrells, who had been wary of Stannis and comfortable with Renly, received the ravens and drew the obvious conclusion. Stannis was dangerous, unpredictable, willing to use methods that no Westerosi lord would sanction. The Tyrells' support for Renly hardened from political calculation into moral conviction, and the 80,000 swords that Renly commanded became not merely a military force, but a moral crusade against a man who had tried to murder his own brother in his bed. And Ned rode north, toward Riverrun, toward the army he had left, toward the war that now had 4 factions instead of 3, Lannisters. Renly, Stannis, and the North, and that had become, through the failure of his mediation, more complicated and more dangerous than the war he had ridden south to prevent. The peacemaker had failed. The cost of the failure would be paid in blood, and the first payments were already coming due. The lion's teeth. Ooh. Ned reached Riverrun on the 20th day of the 6th month, riding hard through rain that had not stopped for 3 days, and that turned the roads of the Riverlands into brown rivers of mud that swallowed hooves to the fetlock. The castle was as he had left it, banners flying, the red fork running high beneath the walls. The Northern and Riverlands forces camped in ordered lines along the southern bank, but the situation had changed in the time he had been gone. The Gretchen met him at the gate. The big man's face carried the expression it wore when he was angry and trying to appear calm, which meant his jaw was set and his voice was louder than the circumstances required. Tywin moved while you were playing peacemaker. His vanguard crossed the red fork at 3 points, here, here, and here. The Gretchen jabbed a map spread across the war table in Riverrune's Great Hall. The points were spaced along a 40-mile stretch of the river, marking fords and bridges that the Lannister forces had seized while the bulk of the Northern Army held defensive positions further west. 2,000 men at each crossing. They're not advancing. They're anchoring. Tywin wants to hold the fords so he can push the main force across when he's ready. Casualties? Light. We pulled back rather than contest the crossings. lost 37 men at Harroway's Ford. The Lannisters hit the garrison before dawn. Stark lost a dozen at the stone bridge south of Pink Maiden. Ned studied the map. Tywin's strategy was visible in the positioning, the movements of a commander who fought wars the way a banker managed investments, calculating risk and return with the cold precision of a man for whom victory was a transaction and defeat was a loss to be avoided through superior preparation. The three crossings formed a line that would allow Tywin to concentrate his forces at any single point while threatening the other two, forcing Ned to defend everywhere and concentrate nowhere. His main force? Still at Harrenhal. 30,000, give or take. He's waiting. For what? For you to make a mistake. Ned looked at the map and saw the war as Tywin saw it, the chess game of a man who preferred winning through positioning rather than through battle. Tywin was not eager to fight. Tywin was never eager to fight. Fighting was what happened when all other methods of establishing dominance had been exhausted. And Tywin's preferred methods, intimidation, economic pressure, strategic patience, had not yet been exhausted. He would sit at Harrenhal and wait for the Northern Alliance to fracture, for the Baratheon brothers to weaken each other, for Ned's supply lines to stretch to breaking, for time to do the work that swords made more expensive. The problem was that Tywin was right. Time favored the Lannisters. Joffrey sat the Iron Throne, and every day he sat it was a day that the realm's institutions, the small council, the city watch, the faith, the guilds, adjusted to his rule and became harder to dislodge. The crown's treasury was depleted, but its credit was good. The Iron Bank of Braavos had not yet cooled its loans, and Lannister gold continued to flow from Casterly Rock. Littlefinger, who remained master of coin and whose loyalties were to himself and to whatever chaos produced the most opportunity, was working to bind the Tyrells to the Lannister cause through a marriage alliance, Margaery Tyrell to King Joffrey, the most beautiful girl in the Reach, wedded to the bastard on the throne. Ned learned this from Varys's network. The spider's intelligence arrived in fragments, coded messages carried by merchants, whispered observations delivered by traveling singers, the accumulated knowledge of a man whose influence operated through information rather than force. Varys did not support Ned. Varys did not support anyone. Varys supported stability, or chaos, or whatever served the purposes that Varys kept hidden behind the mask of a eunuch who served the realm. But the information was accurate, and the information said that the war Ned was fighting had a deadline. If Littlefinger succeeded in marrying Margaery to Joffrey, the Tyrells and their harvests, their wealth, their 60,000 swords, would join the Lannisters, and the balance of power would shift permanently. "We can't wait," Ned told his commanders. They were gathered in Riverrun Solar, the Greatjon, Karstark, Mage Mormont, Edmure, the Blackfish, Bolton, 6 faces representing 60,000 decisions that would be made or not made in the days ahead. Tywin wants us to wait. Every day we wait is a day that Littlefinger works to bring the Tyrells into the Lannister fold. If the Tyrells join Joffrey, we face 80,000 men from the south and 30,000 from Tywin's army. We'll be outnumbered 3-1. Then we fight, the Greatjon said. He said it the way he said everything, as though the answer to every strategic question was the application of sufficient violence. March on Harrenhal. Bring Tywin to battle. End it. Harrenhal is the strongest castle in the 7 Kingdoms, the Blackfish said. Brynden Tully was Edmure's uncle, a veteran of 3 wars, and a man whose tactical instincts had been honed by decades of fighting in the Riverlands. He was lean, silver-haired, with the sharp face of a river hawk and the patience that hawks required. If Tywin stays behind those walls, we'll break ourselves against them. And Tywin knows it. Then, we make him come out, Ned said. The strategy Ned proposed was the strategy of a man who understood his enemy, not Tywin's weakness, because Tywin's weaknesses were few and well defended, but Tywin's nature. Tywin Lannister cared about 3 things: his legacy, his family's dominance, and his reputation. The reputation was the lever. Tywin had spent 40 years building the Lannister name into a synonym for power. And the thing that Tywin could not tolerate was the perception that the Lannisters were weak, that they could be challenged, defied, humiliated without consequence. "We don't attack Harrenhal," Ned said. "We take everything around it. Every castle, every town, every ford, every bridge between Harrenhal and King's Landing. We cut Tywin off from the capital. We interpose our army between his position and the city he's supposed to be defending. And then we wait. We wait. We wait for Tywin to come to us. Because if he sits in Harrenhal while we hold the Riverlands and threaten King's Landing, he becomes the lord who hid behind his walls while the wolves took his territory. And Tywin will not accept that. Tywin will march, and when he marches, we choose the ground." Roose Bolton spoke for the first time. A sound strategy. But it requires speed. The castles between Harrenhal and King's Landing, Darry, the Antlers, the towns along the King's Road must be taken before Tywin realizes the purpose. If he recognizes the encirclement, he'll march before we're in position. Then, we move fast. Bolton, take your forces east along the northern bank. Secure Darry and every crossing point between here and the King's Road. Grachan, push south. Clear the Lannister garrisons from the fords they've taken. Karstark, hold Riverrun with the reserve. Edmure, your Riverlands men know this country. Send riders to every loyal lord between here and Maidenpool. I want every road south of the Trident closed to Lannister supply trains within a fortnight. The orders were given, the army moved. What followed was not a battle, but a campaign. The systematic dismantling of Tywin's logistical network through speed, local knowledge, and the relentless application of northern discipline. Bolton's forces swept east like a blade, taking Darry without a fight when the Lannister garrison fled south rather than face the Bolton banners and the reputation that preceded them. The Greatshorn retook the fords in 3 days of sharp fighting that cost 80 northern lives and 400 Lannister ones. The mathematics of men who held defensive positions against attackers who expected to win, and who discovered, in the crossing of rivers and the climbing of muddy banks, that northern infantry in defensive positions fought with a ferocity that Westerland's levies could not match. Edmure's riverlords performed the task that only local forces could: the choking of supply lines, the closing of roads, the conversion of a countryside from passable to hostile through the simple expedient of removing bridges, felling trees across roads, and establishing patrols that intercepted every wagon, every messenger, every rider carrying Lannister instructions. The Riverlands, which had been Tywin's highway, became Tywin's prison. Within a fortnight, the Northern Riverlands Alliance controlled a crescent of territory stretching from Riverrun to Darry, curving south to threaten the King's Road and cutting Harrenhal off from King's Landing as effectively as a siege, without ever approaching Harrenhal's walls. Tywin Lannister, who had sat in the greatest fortress in the Seven Kingdoms and waited for time to deliver his victory, found that time had delivered an encirclement instead. The ravens from Harrenhal began arriving on the 16th day. Not to Ned, to Tywin's subordinates, to his supply captains, to the garrison commanders who were supposed to be holding the crossings and the roads. The ravens carried orders that spoke of a man whose patience was ending: advance to break the encirclement at Darry, concentrate forces for a push south to reopen the King's Road, prepare for a general advance. The ravens were intercepted by Edmure's patrols, and the orders they carried were brought to Ned, who read them with the satisfaction of a man whose strategy was working, and the knowledge of a man who understood that the next phase would be the most dangerous. Tywin was coming out. The Lion marched from Harrenhal on the 18th day with 28,000 men. He had lost 2,000 to the garrison fighting and the supply disruptions and the general attrition that came from sitting in a ruined castle while the enemy took the countryside. The army moved south along the western shore of the God's Eye, making for the King's Road and King's Landing, taking the most direct route because Tywin did not deviate and did not feint and did not waste men on secondary objectives when the primary objective was clear. Ned was waiting. The ground he had chosen was south of the Ruby Ford, the shallow crossing of the Trident where, 15 years ago, Robert Baratheon had killed Rhaegar Targaryen and scattered the rubies from the prince's armor into the water. The ford was broad, the banks sloped gently on both sides, and the ground to the south rose in a series of low ridges that provided natural defensive positions for an army that arrived first and dug in. Ned arrived first. 23,000 men, Northern and Riverlands combined. held the ridges south of the Ruby Ford in positions that had been prepared over 5 days. The defensive works were not elaborate: earthen ramparts, sharpened stakes, positions for archers on the high ground, but they were sufficient, and they were designed by a man who had fought at the Trident before and who understood the terrain from personal experience rather than maps. Tywin's army appeared on the morning of the 21st day. 28,000 men, armored and bannered, stretching across the northern horizon in a line that demonstrated the Lannister capacity for organization and display. The crimson banners with the golden lion, the heavy cavalry in plate, the crossbowmen in ordered ranks, the supply train extending a mile behind the vanguard. It was a formidable sight, the military expression of Lannister wealth and power, and it was the army of a man who intended to cut through the forces blocking his path to King's Landing, and who had the numbers and the quality to do it. But Tywin was not a fool, and fools attacked prepared positions without reconnaissance. The Lannister army halted north of the ford and made camp. Tywin studied the northern positions through the long afternoon, sending scouts along the river to test the fords and probe the defenses, reading the ground with the eye of a commander who had won a dozen battles and who recognized when the ground favored the defender. The parley came at sunset. Not a formal negotiation, a messenger riding under a white flag, carrying a letter sealed with the Lion of Lannister. Lord Stark, you have positioned yourself between me and the capital I am charged with defending. Your accusations against my grandchildren are lies. Your alliance with the traitor Stannis is treason. But I am not a man who spends lives without purpose. Withdraw to the north. Take your army home. Relinquish your treasonous support for Stannis Baratheon. Do this, and I will grant you safe passage and the continued wardenship of the north. Refuse, and I will cross this river and destroy your army. The choice is yours. Tywin Lannister. Ned read the letter and wrote his reply. The reply was shorter. Lord Tywin, your grandchildren are bastards born of incest. The evidence is conclusive and was confirmed by Stannis Baratheon and by the investigations of the late Jon Arryn. The throne belongs to Stannis by law. If you dispute this, bring your case to a great council and let the lords of the Seven Kingdoms judge. Until then, I hold this ground. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. Tywin read the reply. Whatever his response was, and Tywin's emotional responses were events that happened deep inside the man, invisible on the surface like geological activity beneath a mountain. His military response was immediate. The Lannister army broke camp before dawn and began its advance. The Ruby Ford. The Battle of the Ruby Ford, the second battle at that crossing, fought 15 years after the first and on the same ground where Robert had killed Rhaegar and won a dynasty, began at dawn on the 22nd day and lasted until mid-afternoon and killed 4,000 men and wounded 6,000 more and changed the course of the war. Tywin's plan was the plan of a man who respected his enemy's position and intended to break it through weight. A frontal assault across the ford supported by flanking maneuvers on both sides, using his numerical superiority to stretch the northern line and find the weak point. The Lannister heavy cavalry would cross at the ford itself. The infantry would cross at shallower points upstream and downstream. The crossbowmen would provide covering fire from the north bank. The plan was sound, professional, the product of a competent military mind, and it would have worked against a less experienced commander. Ned's plan was simpler. Hold the ridges. Let them come. Make them pay for every yard. The first assault came at the ford itself, the Lannister heavy cavalry, armored and lanced, splashing through the shallow water in a charge that was designed to overwhelm the northern center through sheer momentum. The cavalry emerged from the water and hit the first line of stakes, and the charge broke. Not the riders' courage, but the horses' legs. The animals screaming and falling and creating a barrier of thrashing horseflesh that blocked the riders behind them. The northern archers on the ridges put arrows into the confusion, not aimed shots but volley fire, the arrows falling in sheets that struck armor and horse and ground without distinction, and the first assault withdrew after 20 minutes, leaving 100 dead and twice that many wounded in the ford and on the near bank. Tywin adjusted. The second assault was infantry, men on foot, carrying shields against the arrows, wading the ford in a line that was broader and lower and harder to break with stakes. The infantry reached the first ridge, and the fighting became what infantry combat always became: close, personal. The clash of sword and shield and axe in a space where tactics dissolved into the arithmetic of strength and will. The northern line held. The Mormont men, islanders, axe fighters, hardened by the frozen forests of Bear Island, anchored the center with a ferocity that compensated for their small numbers. The Karstark forces held the left. The Greatjohn's men held the right. And the Riverlords filled the gaps with the desperate energy of men fighting to protect their own countryside from an invader who had already burned a third of it. The battle turned at mid-morning. Tywin's flanking force, 5,000 men crossing upstream, where the river was narrower and the banks steeper, hit the northern left flank where Karstark's men were thinnest. The fighting was vicious. Haryon Karstark, the Lord's eldest son, led the defense and died on the riverbank with a Lannister spear through his chest, his men fighting over his body with the rage that came from watching a commander fall. Lord Karstark received the news in the center. The grief struck him like a physical blow, the staggering of a father who had just lost a son in the same war that he had joined to defend the same lord who had just sent that son to his death. But Karstark was a northern lord, and northern lords processed grief the way northern winters processed weakness, by burying it under the work that remained. "Hold the line," Karstark said, and the line held. Ned committed the reserve at noon. 2,000 men who had been held behind the third ridge, fresh, rested, fed, deployed against the flanking force that had broken through on the left. The reserve hit the Lannister column as it emerged from the river crossing, caught them disordered, exhausted from the upstream fight. Vulnerable in the way that attacking forces were always vulnerable. When the attack succeeded, and the attackers found themselves deep in enemy territory with their line of retreat blocked by the same river they had just crossed. The flanking force broke. Not a rout, the Lannister forces were too well trained for rout, but a controlled withdrawal back across the river that left 500 dead on the south bank, and that forced Tywin to acknowledge that the northern positions could not be taken through assault. The battle ended in the early afternoon, not with a charge or a surrender, but with a gradual diminishment. The Lannister forces pulling back to the north bank, the northern forces holding their ridges, the ford between them choked with bodies and broken equipment, and the general debris of violence. The river ran pink for a mile downstream, carrying the iron-tinged water that was not quite red enough to recall the rubies that had given the ford its name, but that was close enough to create the metaphor that the chroniclers would later use. Tywin Lannister retreated. Not to Harrenhal, that fortress was cut off, useless, a monument to a strategy that had been outmaneuvered, but east. Toward King's Landing, marching his remaining 24,000 men along the King's Road in a controlled retreat that protected his baggage train and maintained his formation and demonstrated that even in defeat, the lion did not panic. Ned let him go. The decision was debated. The Greatjon wanted pursuit, arguing that a retreating army could be destroyed if pressed, but Ned overruled him. His own army had taken casualties that pursuit would multiply. 1,300 northern and riverland soldiers were dead. 3,000 were wounded. The army that held the ridges south of the Ruby Ford was intact, but diminished. And pursuit across open country against a force that still outnumbered them would convert a defensive victory into an offensive gamble. The victory was real, but incomplete. Tywin had been beaten at the ford, his flanking assault broken, his advance on King's Landing blocked. But Tywin was not destroyed. He was retreating toward King's Landing with 24,000 men. And King's Landing was a city with walls and gates and the accumulated defenses of 300 years of Targaryen paranoia. If Tywin reached the capital, he would be behind those walls, and the war would become a siege. The longest, most expensive, most destructive form of warfare. The kind of war that consumed armies and treasuries and kingdoms while the defenders ate and waited. Ned sat in his tent that evening, and counted the cost. 1,300 dead, Harry and Karstark among them. 3,000 wounded, a third of whom would not fight again. The war was not over. The war was entering its most dangerous phase, the phase where victories created opportunities, and opportunities required more men and more time and more blood. And the supply of all three was finite. He wrote 2 letters, one to Winterfell, to Robb and Catelyn, reporting the victory, omitting the cost, including the details that a young man learning to govern and a mother worrying about her husband would need. The second to Dragonstone, to Stannis, reporting Tywin's retreat toward King's Landing and urging Stannis to launch his naval assault on the capital while Tywin was in transit. If Stannis' fleet struck King's Landing while Tywin was still on the King's Road, the city might fall before the Lion could reinforce it. The letter to Stannis went by fast rider to the coast, and then by ship, a route that would take a week. The timing was tight. Tywin would reach King's Landing in 10 days, marching at forced pace. Stannis needed to be in Blackwater Bay before Tywin arrived. The margin between victory and failure was measured in days, and days were not a margin that Ned was comfortable with. But there was no alternative. The war had its own momentum now, and the momentum demanded that Ned trust Stannis to act, the man who had tried to assassinate his own brother, the man whose priestess wielded shadow magic, the man whose commitment to the law was absolute and whose methods had proven, at Storm's End, to be something less. Ned trusted Stannis' ambition, if not his judgment, and ambition was a reliable engine for the kind of action that the moment required. The price of honor. The problems arrived by Raven. The first was from Renly, addressed to all the lords of the realm, a formal declaration of war against Stannis Baratheon, denouncing him as a kinslayer and a sorcerer and a man unfit for the throne. The declaration included a call to arms. All lords who supported the rightful king were summoned to march under Renly's banner and appointed absence. The declaration made no mention of the Lannisters, no condemnation of Joffrey, no recognition of the incest that was the foundation of Stannis' and Ned's legal case. Renly was fighting Stannis, not the Lannisters, and the omission was a political signal, the signal of a man who was positioning himself to negotiate with whoever emerged from the war between North and West, and whose primary enemy was his own brother rather than the bastard on the throne. The second Raven was from Varys. The coded message, when deciphered, carried news that reconfigured the war. Littlefinger had succeeded. Margaery Tyrell would marry Joffrey. The betrothal was announced. The Tyrells were committed to the Lannister cause. 60,000 swords, the breadbasket of the continent, the wealth of Highgarden, all of it flowing to King's Landing, to the Iron Throne, to the defense of a bastard king whose legitimacy was sustained by convenience and by the inability of his opponents to unite against him. The third Raven was from Winterfell. Bran's message was brief and carried the weight that children's messages carried when the children were growing up faster than the world was supposed to require. Father, I am learning to use the ravens. Robb says the harvest is good. Mother worries. Old Nan tells me stories about the long night. I dreamed of wolves last night. Ned read the 3 messages and felt the weight of each. The political, the strategic, the personal, pressing on him from different directions with equal force. The Tyrell alliance with the Lannisters changed the arithmetic of the war. Before, it had been 30,000 Lannisters against 23,000 Northern and Riverlands forces, with Stannis' smaller fleet as a potential ally and Renly's large army as a wildcard. Now it was 90,000, Lannisters plus Tyrells, against Ned's diminished force and Stannis' uncertain cooperation. The numbers were catastrophic. He gathered his commanders. The Tyrells have joined the Lannisters. Margaery Tyrell will marry Joffrey. Mace Tyrell is marching his army north to reinforce King's Landing. The silence that followed was the silence of men who understood arithmetic. The Great John's fist tightened on the arm of his chair. Karstark stared at the table with the emptied expression of a man who had buried his eldest son 3 days ago and who was now hearing that the war that killed him had become unwinnable. Mage Mormont crossed her arms. Bolton's face showed nothing, which was Bolton's face in every circumstance, and which conveyed in its blankness. A calculation that Bolton was performing behind features that had been trained to reveal nothing. Options, Ned said. We march south and take King's Landing before the Tyrells arrive, the Great John said. Hit the city while Tywin's still on the road. Storm the walls. With what siege equipment? The Blackfish asked. King's Landing has the largest urban walls in the Seven Kingdoms. We have no rams, no towers, no ships. A frontal assault would be butchery. Then we negotiate, Edmure said. Open talks with Renly. He has the Stormlands. If we can bring Renly back into the alliance against the Lannisters, Renly will not ally with us while we support Stannis, Ned said. And I will not abandon Stannis' claim. Stannis is the lawful king. That has not changed, because the Tyrells have chosen expediency over law. Then we lose, Bolton said. His voice was quiet, the quiet of a man stating a mathematical conclusion. The numbers say we lose. Unless the numbers change. The numbers will change, Ned said. When Stannis takes King's Landing. If Stannis takes King's Landing, Bolton corrected. Stannis has a fleet. King's Landing has no fleet. Joffrey's navy is non-existent. Stannis' assault from the sea, combined with our pressure from the north, can take the city before the Tyrells arrive. That was always the strategy. Stannis strikes from the water. We pin Tywin on land. The city falls. And if it doesn't? Ned did not answer. The silence was the answer. The acknowledgement that the entire strategy depended on Stannis' willingness and ability to act, and that Stannis' recent behavior, the shadow, the attempted assassination of his own brother, the destruction of the alliance that Ned had brokered, provided limited confidence in Stannis' judgment. Roose Bolton stayed after the others left. The Lord of the Dreadfort stood by the window, looking out over the Red Fork, his pale eyes tracking the water with the patience of a man who was accustomed to waiting, and who found the waiting productive rather than tedious. You know there is another path, Bolton said. I know you're about to suggest one. Contact the Tyrells directly, not through Renly, around him. Offer Margaery to Robb. The Stark name carries weight. The North is the largest kingdom. A Stark-Tyrell alliance would outweigh the Lannister offer. Robb is 16. Margaery is 16. They're the same age. And the Tyrells care about power, not affection. Mace Tyrell will marry his daughter to whoever offers the better arrangement, and a king in the north is a more attractive prospect than a bastard whose claim depends on a lie. Ned looked at Bolton. The proposal was politically intelligent. Bolton was always politically intelligent, and it was the kind of proposal that Ned's instincts rejected because it involved trading his son's future for a military alliance, and because it required abandoning Stannis' claim in favor of northern independence, which was a position that the Great John had been advocating since the war began, and that Ned had rejected because it meant breaking faith with the man he had declared for. I declared for Stannis. I gave my word. Your word is killing your army. The Tyrells will arrive in a month with 60,000 men. Your word will not stop them. Your word will not resurrect the 1,300 men who died at the Ruby Ford. Your word is a luxury that the living cannot afford. My word is the only thing that distinguishes us from the Lannisters. Bolton held Ned's gaze without expression. The gaze was the gaze of a man who had measured honor and found it lighter than he expected, lighter than survival, lighter than victory, lighter than the cold pragmatism that the Boltons had practiced for 1,000 years in a castle whose walls were decorated with the flayed skins of their enemies. As you say, Lord Stark. Bolton left. Ned stood alone in the solar and felt the isolation that command produced, the loneliness of a man whose decisions determined whether other men lived or died, and whose principles limited his decisions in ways that his enemies' principles did not. Bolton was right about the mathematics. Bolton was wrong about the solution. Abandoning Stannis would make Ned's word worthless. And a lord whose word was worthless was not a lord at all. He was a man with soldiers. And men with soldiers who lacked principles were the very thing that had put the Lannisters on the throne. The thought was clean, but the reality was dirty, and the gap between the two was where the dead accumulated. He wrote to Stannis again. The letter was urgent. more urgent than the previous one, stripped of diplomatic courtesy, carrying the blunt northern directness that was Ned's default when circumstances left no room for politeness. The Tyrells have joined the Lannisters. Margaery Tyrell will marry Joffrey. 60,000 men are marching north. If you intend to take the throne that is yours by right, you must act now. Attack King's Landing. Your fleet can take the city before the Tyrell reinforcements arrive. Every day you delay is a day that the enemy strengthens. This is not counsel. This is the truth. Strike now or lose everything. The letter went by Raven to Dragonstone. The response, when it came 3 days later, was Stannis at his most compressed. I am coming. Prepare for the assault. Stannis was coming. The question was whether he would come in time. Metu. Stannis attacked King's Landing on the first day of the 8th month, his fleet sailing into Blackwater Bay at dawn with the tide and the wind, and the grim determination of a man who had waited long enough and whose patience, that grinding, volcanic patience, had finally been consumed by the necessity of action. Ned was not there. He received the reports afterward, pieced together from ravens and riders and the fragmented testimony of men who survived a battle that was uglier and more costly than anyone had anticipated. The Lannister defense of King's Landing was organized by Tyrion Lannister, and the defense was brilliant. The imp, Tywin's youngest son, the dwarf, the despised brother, the man whose family treated him as a punishment rather than a relative, had been sent to King's Landing as acting hand of the king, and he had used the months of preparation to turn the city's defenses into a weapon. The chain across the Blackwater Rush, a massive chain of iron links stretched between the two banks of the river, hidden beneath the water until the moment Stannis' fleet entered the river mouth. The chain was raised behind the fleet, trapping the ships between the chain and the city's defenders. And then, the wildfire. Green fire. Alchemist's fire. The substance that the Mad King had stockpiled beneath King's Landing and that Tyrion had repurposed. Jars of it. Hundreds of jars, loaded onto a ship that was released into the trapped fleet and ignited. The Blackwater Rush became a river of green flame. Ships burned. Men burned. The water itself seemed to burn, the wildfire spreading across the surface in sheets that consumed wood and canvas and flesh with the same indiscriminate appetite. Stannis lost half his fleet in the river. Hundreds of men cooking in their armor as the ships beneath them dissolved into fire. But Stannis was Stannis, and Stannis did not retreat. The surviving ships landed men on the south bank, and Stannis led them himself, the king, the claimant, the man who had held Storm's End through a year of starvation, climbing the muddy bank of the Blackwater Rush in full armor and leading the assault on the city gates with the fury of a man whose patience had finally broken, and whose breaking produced not chaos, but a terrible, directed focus. The battle at the walls was ferocious. Stannis' men breached the Mudgate, the weakest point in King's Landing's defenses, held by city watchmen whose training and loyalty were both suspect. The fighting in the streets was house to house, block to block, the kind of urban combat that consumed soldiers the way fire consumed wood, indiscriminately, rapidly, without regard for rank or skill. Tyrion Lannister led a sortie from the walls. The imp, armored and mounted on a horse too large for him, rode into the breach with a force of knights and sellswords and turned the penetration back through tactics and personal courage that his family would never acknowledge and that saved the city from falling. Tyrion was wounded in the fighting. A slash across the face that nearly killed him and that would mark him for the rest of his life, but the sortie held, and the Mudgate was resealed, and Stannis' assault stalled on the south bank with the green fires still burning on the water behind him. Tywin arrived at sunset. 24,000 Lannister troops arriving from the northwest along the Gold Road, hitting Stannis' rear with the timing that was either military genius or divine fortune, and that was, in reality, the product of hard marching and the intelligence network that Tywin maintained and that had tracked Stannis' fleet from the moment it left Dragonstone. But Tywin did not arrive alone. The Tyrell vanguard, 10,000 men under Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, arriving from the south along the Rose Road, hit Stannis' right flank at the same time that Tywin hit his rear. The hammer and the anvil. The combined Lannister-Tyrell force outnumbered Stannis' surviving army 3-1, and the battle that followed was not a battle, but a destruction. Stannis' army broke. Not the man. Stannis himself had to be dragged from the field by his guards. Fighting and cursing and refusing to acknowledge a defeat that was total and visible to everyone except the man in the center of it. But the army, which was composed of men whose commitment to Stannis' cause was real, but whose survival instincts were stronger than their loyalty. The survivors fled to Stannis' remaining ships. The ships fled Blackwater Bay. Stannis retreated to Dragonstone with a third of the men he had brought and none of the fleet he had sailed. The Battle of the Blackwater was a catastrophe. For Stannis, it was the end of his military campaign. For Ned, it was the end of his strategy. The plan, pin Tywin on land while Stannis strikes from the sea, had been sound. But the plan had assumed that Stannis would attack before Tywin reached the city, and Tywin had marched faster than Ned's calculations allowed. The timing, which Ned had identified as the critical variable, had failed. The news reached Ned at Riverrun 4 days after the battle. He read the reports in the Solar, where he had planned the campaign, and felt the strategy collapsing around him like architecture losing its foundation. Stannis was broken. Tywin was in King's Landing. The Tyrells were committed. The arithmetic that Bolton had described, 90,000 against 20,000, was no longer theoretical. It was fact. What now? Edmure asked. Ned looked at the map. The map showed the same geography it had always shown: rivers, castles, roads, the immutable terrain that wars were fought across, but that wars could not change. What had changed was the balance of power. Ned held the Riverlands. The Lannisters and Tyrells held King's Landing and the South. Stannis held nothing but Dragonstone and his pride. Renly held the Stormlands and his grievance. The war had fractured from a two-sided conflict into a scattered collection of enmities, and the fracturing favored the side with the most resources. "We hold what we have," Ned said. "The Riverlands, the North, the Trident. We strengthen our defenses and wait for the political landscape to shift." Wait for what? Wait for Joffrey to be Joffrey. The answer was not a strategy. It was a recognition. The recognition that the bastard on the Iron Throne was, by every account, a monster in the making, and that monsters in power eventually alienated their allies. Joffrey's cruelty, his impulsiveness, his contempt for the lords who supported him, these were liabilities that would compound over time. And time was the one resource that Ned could still deploy. It was not a satisfying answer. It was not the kind of answer that the Great Jon or Karstark or any of the Northern Lords wanted. They wanted battle, victory, the decisive moment that would end the war and send them home. Instead, they got patience. The patience of a man who recognized that the war could not be won by force alone, and who was searching for the lever that would shift the balance. The lever arrived from an unexpected direction. The letter from the south. Olenna Tyrell wrote to Ned Stark. The letter arrived by a route that bypassed the normal Raven network, carried by a merchant ship from Oldtown to Seaguard, then by a rider who presented himself at Riverroon's gate with the Thorned Rose seal, and the demeanor of a man who understood that the message he carried was worth his life and would be handled accordingly. The Queen of Thorns was 80 years old, sharp-tongued, sharp-minded, and entirely uninterested in the political fantasies that younger people constructed around war and glory. She was interested in power, and power was a practical matter, the matter of who controlled what, and why, and for how long. Her letter was written in a hand that was steady despite her age, and in a style that was direct despite her reputation for obliqueness. Lord Stark. My son is a fool, and my grandson's new bride is not. The boy on the Iron Throne is a creature whose cruelty will eventually make him untenable. You know this. I know this. The question is not whether Joffrey will fall, but when and who replaces him. I have no interest in discussing this by Raven. I propose a meeting, not a parley, a conversation. between an old woman who wants her granddaughter to be queen and a man who wants to go home. Send your reply by the same route. Tell no one who does not need to know. Ned read the letter twice. The first reading was for content. The second was for intent, the deeper message beneath the words, the calculation that Olenna Tyrell was making, and the opportunity that the calculation represented. The Tyrells had married Margaery to Joffrey. The Tyrells had committed their army to the Lannister cause. The Tyrells had helped destroy Stannis at the Blackwater. And now the matriarch of that family was writing to the enemy and proposing a secret meeting. The contradictions were not contradictions. They were strategy. Olenna Tyrell had bet on the Lannisters because the Lannisters had offered the best deal. And now Olenna Tyrell was hedging the bet because hedging was what intelligent gamblers did. The meeting happened at Bitterbridge, a town on the Mander, equidistant from Highgarden and the Riverlands, chosen because it was far enough from both power centers to provide deniability and close enough to both to provide escape routes. Ned rode with 20 men, wearing no sigil, traveling as a minor lord on unnamed business. The precautions were Olenna's. The old woman understood that a meeting between a Tyrell and a Stark, if discovered, would upend the alliance that her son had just forged and that she was planning to betray. Olenna arrived in a wheelhouse drawn by 4 white horses, accompanied by 12 guards and a young woman whose beauty was the kind that launched political careers, Margaery Tyrell, the Queen. The bride, the granddaughter whose marriage was the axis around which the alliance turned. The meeting took place in a private room above an inn. Olenna, Margaery, and Ned. No attendants. No witnesses. Lord Stark. You look like your reputation. Honest, exhausted, and stubborn. Sit, we have matters to discuss that I would prefer to resolve before I die, which at my age could be any day. Ned sat. He studied the old woman, small, sharp, draped in green silk, with a face that age had carved into a weapon. Margaery sat beside her grandmother, composed, attentive, beautiful in the deliberate way that beautiful women were beautiful when they understood that beauty was a form of power and wielded it accordingly. You wrote to me, Ned said. Why? Because Joffrey is a monster. That is not an opinion. It is a diagnosis. My granddaughter married him 6 weeks ago, and in those 6 weeks, the boy has beaten a servant with a crossbow bolt, ordered the tongue removed from a singer who displeased him, and threatened Margaery with language that would shame a dockworker. He is a product of incest and bad parenting, and he will not improve. You knew what he was before the wedding. I knew what was reported. Reports are edited. The reality is worse. Olenna's voice carried no regret. The voice of a woman who made decisions and assessed their consequences without the luxury of self-recrimination. I made a calculation. The calculation was wrong. The Lannisters offered a crown, and a crown is worth enduring a difficult king. But Joffrey is not difficult. Joffrey is dangerous. Not to the realm, to Margaery. And my granddaughter's safety is not a variable I am willing to accept as a cost. Margaery spoke. Her voice was measured, the voice of a young woman who was learning the language of power from a grandmother who spoke it fluently. My husband threatened to have me whipped if I did not produce an heir within a year. He was not joking. He does not joke. He issues commands and expects them to be followed, and the commands are becoming more erratic and more violent. Ned looked at Margaery and saw, behind the composed exterior, the assessment of a woman who had entered a marriage expecting difficulty and discovered danger. The distinction that separated political inconvenience from physical threat. What do you want? Ned asked. Joffrey removed. Tommen on the throne. Tommen is 8 years old, pliable, good-natured, and controllable. As Tommen's queen, once Joffrey is gone and Tommen succeeds, Margaery will have the influence that the marriage was supposed to provide without the danger that the current king presents. You want me to help you remove Joffrey. I want you to help me save my granddaughter. The removal of Joffrey is a method, not a goal. Ned leaned back. The proposal was clear. The Tyrells wanted Joffrey gone, Tommen crowned, Margaery remarried to the younger brother. The Tyrells would switch sides, or more precisely, The Tyrells would switch the composition of their side, supporting a different Baratheon claimant while maintaining their position at court. It was a palace coup dressed as a succession, and it required Ned's cooperation because Ned's army was the military pressure that would prevent the Lannisters from resisting the change. Stannis is the lawful king, Ned said, not Tommen. Tommen is a bastard, the same as Joffrey. Olenna's eyes narrowed. The narrowing was the expression of a woman who had anticipated the objection and who found it tiresome. Lord Stark. Stannis is a broken man on a rock in the sea. He has no fleet, no army, and no allies except a red witch whose magic failed to kill a boy who was standing 20 feet from the shadow she summoned. Stannis's claim is legal and irrelevant. Tommen's claim is illegal and practical. The choice is between a king who cannot hold the throne and a king who can, and the only question is whether you prefer legal purity or a living realm. I prefer both. Both is not available. Choose. Ned looked at Margaery. The young queen looked back at him with the steady gaze of a woman who was asking for help, and who was willing to offer help in return, and whose offer was substantial. If I agree, Ned said. What do the Tyrells offer? The Tyrell army withdraws from King's Landing. Mace Tyrell declines to support the Lannister response. In effect, the Lannisters lose 60,000 swords overnight. Additionally, the Reach's harvest, the food that King's Landing depends on, is redirected away from the capital. The city starves. The Lannister position becomes untenable within months. And the North? The North goes home. The wardenship of the North confirmed, permanently, Robb Stark betrothed to Margaery's cousin, if you wish, a connection, not a condition. And the recognition that the North acted with honor throughout the war, which will matter when the histories are written. Ned stood and walked to the window. The view was the Mander, a wide brown river moving slowly through flat country toward the sea. The view told him nothing. The decision was not a matter of geography. Stannis was the lawful king. Ned had declared for Stannis. Ned had fought a war for Stannis's claim. Men had died for Stannis's claim, Harry and Karstark and 1,300 others, bleeding into the Ruby Ford in service of the law that Ned had invoked when he rallied the North. Abandoning Stannis's claim now would make those deaths retroactively meaningless, sacrifices for a principle that the man who invoked the principle chose to discard when the principle became inconvenient. But Stannis had lost. Stannis's army was destroyed. Stannis's fleet was at the bottom of Blackwater Bay. Stannis's claim, legal though it was, could not be enforced. Not by Stannis's remaining forces, not by Ned's diminished army, not by any combination of arms that could be assembled against 90,000 Lannister and Tyrell swords. The law said Stannis was king. Reality said Stannis was a lord on an island with a red priestess and a daughter with grayscale and no capacity to take the throne that the law gave him. The choice was between a principle and a people, between the law that Ned had sworn to uphold and the living men whose lives depended on the decisions that Ned made in this room, in this moment, with this old woman watching him and waiting for the answer that would determine whether the war continued or ended. I need time, Ned said. Time is the one thing we do not have. Joffrey is deteriorating. His violence is escalating. Cersei cannot control him. She created him, and the creation has exceeded the creator's intentions. Tywin is the only person Joffrey fears, and Tywin is occupied with consolidating power and rebuilding the treasury. If we wait, Margaery could be harmed, or Joffrey could provoke a crisis that makes a controlled succession impossible. The opportunity is now. I will not abandon Stannis without speaking to him. Olenna studied Ned for a long moment. The study was the assessment of a woman who was evaluating a man's character and deciding whether his stubbornness was an obstacle or a feature. Speak to Stannis. Tell him what you wish. But understand, Lord Stark, if Stannis refuses to accept reality, and you refuse to act without Stannis, then my granddaughter will protect herself by other means. And those means will not include consideration for northern interests. The meeting ended. Ned rode back to Riverrun with 20 men and a decision that he could not make and could not avoid. Ned went to Dragonstone. He took a ship from Sagard, a merchant vessel, fast and unremarkable, flying no banner, and sailed south through the waters off the western coast, around the Cape, and into the narrow sea. The voyage took 8 days and was the loneliest 8 days of the war. The isolation of a man traveling to deliver news that would anger the person receiving it and who was making the journey, because the news had to be delivered in person, face to face, with the directness that Ned owed Stannis, and that Stannis, of all people, would demand. Dragonstone was as it always was, a volcanic island whose castle was built from black stone carved into the shapes of dragons, a fortress that the Targaryens had raised and that Stannis had inherited, and that reflected its current occupant's personality as accurately as if the stones had been recarved, stark, severe, unadorned by anything that was not functional. The gargoyles on the walls, dragon-shaped, grotesque, carved from the same black stone as the walls themselves, stared down at visitors with expressions that combined menace and indifference. The expressions of creatures that had guarded this island for 300 years and that could not be bothered to care about whoever was arriving now. Stannis received Ned in the chamber of the painted table, the room that dominated Dragonstone's tower, built around an enormous table carved in the shape of Westeros, painted with the geography of the 7 kingdoms. The table was Aegon's, the conqueror's planning surface, the map from which the Targaryen dynasty had directed the conquest and the governance of a continent. Stannis stood behind it like a man standing behind a pulpit. The geography of his kingdom spread before him, the geography that mocked him, because the kingdom it depicted was the kingdom he had lost. He looked worse. The Blackwater had aged him, the defeat visible in the deeper lines around his mouth, the sharper angles of his jaw, the shadows under eyes that had not slept well since the green fire had consumed his fleet. Melisandre stood behind him, as always, her red presence a constant against Stannis's grey. Lord Stark, you come in person. That means the news is bad enough that you didn't trust a raven. The news is complicated. Complicated is bad news with additional steps, Ned told him. The Tyrells' discontent. Olenna's letter. The meeting at Bitterbridge. The proposal, Joffrey removed, Tommen crowned, Margaria's queen. The Tyrell army withdrawn from the Lannister alliance. The cost, Stannis's claim, set aside. A bastard on the throne, a younger, controllable bastard, but a bastard nonetheless, whose reign would be built on the same lie that Stannis had spent years trying to expose. Stannis listened without interrupting. The listening was its own form of violence, the controlled absorption of information that contradicted everything Stannis believed, and that demanded a response that Stannis's nature made almost impossible to deliver. You are asking me to surrender my claim. I am asking you to consider a path that does not end in your death. My claim is the law. You said so yourself at Storm's End. You looked my brother in the eye and said the law supports Stannis. Were you lying? The law has not changed. The situation has. The situation. Stannis's voice carried the cold fury that was his version of shouting, the compressed rage of a man who experienced injustice as a physical assault and who was being asked to accept the most profound injustice of his life. The situation is that I fought. I bled. I lost my fleet and half my army. I held Storm's End for a year eating boot leather while my brothers feasted. I did my duty. I always did my duty, and now, because the duty did not produce the result that the world wanted, I am expected to surrender the reward that the duty earned. You lost the Blackwater. I lost the battle. I did not lose the right. Rights do not expire because of military defeat. If they did, no defeated claim would ever be valid, and the law would be a catalogue of victories rather than a body of principles. Stannis, you have 3,000 men. The Lannisters have 30,000. The Tyrells have 60,000. You cannot take King's Landing. You cannot enforce your claim. The law says you are king, and the law is powerless to make you one. Stannis turned away. He walked to the window, the narrow, dragon-shaped window that looked out over the sea, and stood with his back to Ned, his hands clasped behind him, his spine rigid. Melisandre watched, but did not speak. I was the only one who did his duty, Stannis said. His voice was quieter now, not soft, because Stannis was never soft, but reduced, the voice of a man speaking to himself as much as to the man behind him. Robert took the throne and wasted it. Renly tried to steal what he had not earned. The Lannisters murdered and schemed and put a bastard on the throne. I alone stood for the law. I alone insisted that right mattered. And you are telling me that right does not matter, that duty does not matter, that the man who did everything correctly loses because the men who did everything wrong had more swords. I am telling you that reality is what it is. Reality. The word was a curse in Stannis' mouth. I have spent my life being punished for refusing to ignore reality. Robert ignored reality and was loved for it. Renly ignored reality and was adored. I saw reality clearly, every slight, every injustice, every moment when my brothers received what I had earned. And I was hated for seeing it. And now you ask me to ignore the one reality that I refuse to surrender, that I am the king and the throne is mine. The silence that followed was a silence between two men who respected each other and who were arriving at the place where respect and agreement diverged. Ned understood Stannis, understood the grinding, painful integrity that made Stannis impossible to like and impossible to dismiss. Stannis' claim was legal. Stannis' grievance was legitimate. Stannis' fury at a world that rewarded charm and punished duty was the fury of a man who had been wronged so consistently that the wronging had become the defining feature of his character. But understanding did not change the arithmetic. What would you have me do? Ned asked. Continue the war? March my 20,000 against 90,000? Watch more men die for a claim that cannot be enforced? You swore to support my claim. I swore. And I have supported it. With blood, with war, with the lives of men who trusted me to lead them wisely. I have paid for your claim, Stannis. The question is whether I continue paying when the cost exceeds any possible return. You sound like Renly. Renly wanted the throne for himself. I want to go home. I want my men to go home. I want this war to end with a result that is imperfect and livable rather than a result that is principled and catastrophic. Stannis turned from the window. His face was the face it always was. Hard, set, unreadable, but his eyes were the eyes of a man standing at the edge of something and knowing that the step forward was a step into a void. If I set aside my claim, Stannis said, I am nothing. I am a lord on a barren rock who did everything right and received nothing. That is what you are asking me to become. I am asking you to live, to hold Dragonstone, to serve as a check on whatever power the Tyrells and the Lannisters construct, to be the man who keeps the truth alive, the truth about Joffrey, the truth about the succession, so that the truth has a voice, even if it does not have a throne. A voice without power is a whisper, and whispers are for eunuchs. Ned waited. The waiting was not tactical. It was the waiting of a man who had said what he came to say, and who could not say more, because more would be dishonest. Stannis ground his teeth. The sound filled the room, the physical manifestation of a man whose jaw was clenched against words that he did not want to speak, and that were being forced out by the same commitment to honesty that had defined his entire life. I will not surrender my claim. I will not declare it void. I will not recognize a bastard on the throne. But the word was wrenched from him. I will not prevent you from acting. If the Tyrells move against Joffrey, and if the result is a world that is less unjust than the current one, I will not oppose it. I will not support it. I will stand aside. And when the histories are written, the historians will record that Stannis Baratheon was the rightful king, and that the realm chose expediency over law, and the historians will be correct. It was not agreement. It was not surrender. It was the closest thing to flexibility that Stannis Baratheon could produce. The strategic passivity of a man who recognized defeat without accepting it, who permitted an outcome without endorsing it, who found, in the narrow space between resistance and capitulation, a position that preserved his honor without destroying his allies. Thank you, Ned said. Do not thank me. What you are about to do is wrong. It is necessary, but it is wrong." Ned left Dragonstone. Behind him, Stannis stood at the painted table with Melisandre beside him, looking down at the map of a kingdom that the law said was his and that the world had decided would belong to someone else. The removal of Joffrey Baratheon from the Iron Throne was accomplished with a cup of wine. The details were Olenna's. The execution was Olenna's. The timing, the method, the selection of the poison, a substance called the Strangler, distilled from a plant that grew on the islands east of Essos and that was nearly undetectable and nearly instantaneous. All of it was Olenna's. Ned's contribution was the military pressure that made the removal possible. Northern forces holding the Riverlands, threatening the Kingsroad, creating the security environment in which the Tyrells could act without fear of Lannister retaliation. The wedding feast was held in the Great Hall of the Red Keep, a celebration of Joffrey's marriage to Margaery that was also, in the estimation of the woman who planned it, the marriage's termination. Joffrey drank. Joffrey choked. Joffrey died on the floor of the Great Hall, with his hands at his throat, and his face turning the purple that would give the event its name. And the realm changed in the time it took a boy king to stop breathing. Cersei screamed. The scream was the sound of a mother watching her firstborn die, and was genuine. The grief of a woman who had created a monster, and who loved the monster, because the monster was hers. Tyrion Lannister, who was present at the feast, and who was Cersei's least favorite person in any room, was accused immediately. Cersei's grief directed itself at the nearest target, and Tyrion was always the nearest target when Cersei needed someone to blame. Tyrion was arrested. The arrest was unjust. Tyrion had not poisoned Joffrey, and the accusation was the product of Cersei's hatred rather than evidence. But the injustice served the Tyrells' purposes, because Tyrion's arrest distracted from the true source of the poisoning and provided the court with a narrative that explained the king's death without implicating the people who had actually arranged it. Tommen Baratheon was crowned within a week. The boy, 8 years old, round-faced, gentle, fond of cats, and disinclined toward cruelty, was placed on the Iron Throne with the crown that his brother had worn, and the uncertainty that comes from being given power that you did not seek and do not understand. Margaery became Tommen's betrothed, the transition managed by Olenna with the efficiency of a woman who had planned for exactly this outcome, and whose planning included the administrative details that others overlooked. Tywin Lannister's response was the response of a man who recognized power shifts the way a seasoned merchant recognized market corrections, with displeasure that was subordinated to adaptation. Tywin had lost a grandson. Tywin had gained a more manageable king. The calculation was cold, but the calculation was correct. Tommen was easier to control than Joffrey. The Tyrell alliance was preserved through Margaery's betrothal to Tommen, and the realm's stability, which Tywin valued above sentiment, was strengthened by the removal of a king whose instability threatened it. The war changed. With Tommen on the throne, the Tyrells' anger at Joffrey was resolved. Margaery was safe. The political objective that had driven Olenna to write to Ned, the protection of her granddaughter, was achieved. But the arrangement that Olenna had offered Ned, the withdrawal of Tyrell forces, the redirection of harvests, the strategic abandonment of the Lannister alliance, had been conditioned on Ned's cooperation, and the cooperation had been delivered, and Olenna Tyrell honored her agreements because Olenna Tyrell understood that a reputation for reliability was worth more than any single betrayal. The Tyrell army withdrew from King's Landing. Not all of it. 10,000 remained as the Queen's Guard and as a demonstration of Tyrell investment in the new regime. But the bulk of the force, 50,000 men, returned to the Reach. The withdrawal was framed as a redeployment. The Lords of the Reach needed to return to their harvests. The Ironborn were raiding the western coast. The campaign season was ending. The framing was transparent to anyone paying attention, but the withdrawal was real, and the military balance shifted. Tywin Lannister, who had been defended by 90,000 swords, now had 30,000. Ned's 20,000 faced those 30,000 across the Riverlands, and the balance, while not favorable, was survivable. And then Tywin died. The lion falls. Tyrion Lannister killed his father on the night before his execution. The sequence was domestic and devastating. Tyrion, condemned to death for a murder he did not commit, escaped his cell with the help of Jaime Lannister, the brother who loved him, the only Lannister who treated Tyrion as family rather than punishment, and climbed the Tower of the Hand to confront his father. He found Tywin in his chambers. He found his father with a crossbow bolt through the bowels, dying on the privy, killed by the son he had spent a lifetime despising. The details reached Ned through Varys' network, and the details were verified by subsequent events. Tyrion fled King's Landing. Tywin was buried in the Great Sept of Baelor, with the ceremony that his position demanded, and the smell that his wound produced. Cersei, deprived of her father's protection and her father's intelligence, became the effective ruler of King's Landing, a role for which she was spectacularly unqualified. The war did not end with Tywin's death. Wars rarely end with a single death. They end with the accumulation of deaths and costs and exhaustion that make continuation impossible. But Tywin's death removed the organizing intelligence from the Lannister side. The strategic mind that had held the alliance together managed the finances, directed the military operations, and maintained the discipline that prevented the Lannister cause from collapsing under the weight of its own internal contradictions. Without Tywin, the Lannisters had Cersei, paranoid, vindictive, convinced of a brilliance she did not possess, and the governance of the realm deteriorated from competent authoritarianism into erratic despotism. Ned sued for peace. The negotiation was conducted through intermediaries, Olenna Tyrell, who served as broker between the factions, and the High Septon, whose involvement lent religious legitimacy to a process that was fundamentally political. The terms were Ned's, proposed, revised, accepted over a period of weeks that consumed the final months of the war. Tommen remained king. The legal fiction of his legitimacy was maintained. No one at the negotiating table believed it, but the fiction preserved stability, and stability was the currency that everyone at the table valued above truth. Stannis' claim was acknowledged in a private document that was sealed and deposited with the Iron Bank of Braavos, a compromise that satisfied Stannis' need for recognition without satisfying his need for power, and that preserved the truth for posterity without imposing the truth on the present. The North withdrew. The Northern Army marched home through the Twins and up the King's Road, carrying its dead and its wounded and its banners, and the knowledge that the war had been fought and survived but not won. Not in the way that wars were supposed to be won, with clear victory and clear defeat, but in the way that wars actually ended, with compromise and exhaustion and the mutual recognition that continuation was more expensive than settlement. Ned's conditions were enforced through the only mechanism that worked, the Tyrells' control of the food supply, and the implicit threat that the Tyrells would withdraw their support if the terms were violated. Cersei, who wanted to continue the war, was overruled by the small council. Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother, who had assumed the role of Hand, recognized that the Lannister position was untenable without Tyrell support, and that Tyrell support was contingent on peace. The peace held. It was not a good peace. It was a peace built on lies, sustained by threats, and maintained by the fragile balance of factions whose interests overlapped just enough to prevent war, and not enough to produce trust. But it was peace. And peace was the thing that the realm needed more than justice or truth, or the satisfaction of any individual claim. The realm that remains. Ned came home in the autumn. The ride north through the Neck was the reverse of the ride south. The same roads, the same landscape, the same grey sky that covered the north like a lid. But the man riding was different from the man who had ridden south. The man who had ridden south had been certain of the law, certain of his cause, certain that right would produce right, and that duty would produce justice. The man riding home was not certain of anything except that he was alive, and that the men riding with him were alive, and that the certainty he had carried south had been reduced to a residue that was harder to name and harder to hold. 17,000 men had marched south with Ned Stark. 14,000 came home. 3,000 were dead, buried in the riverlands, drowned in the Ruby Ford, broken at crossings and skirmishes, and the dozen nameless engagements that a war produced between its battles. 3,000 men who would not return to their families, who would not harvest their fields, who would not see another northern winter, and whose deaths had purchased a peace that satisfied no one and that had been necessary because the alternative was worse. Winterfell appeared through the autumn mist like a memory, the granite walls, the smoking towers, the godswood rising above the inner keep, the castle that had been home to Starks for 8,000 years and that looked, from a distance, exactly as it had when Ned left. The appearance was not deceptive. Winterfell had not been touched by the war. Robb had held it. The Ironborn had not attacked. Theon Greyjoy, who had been raised at Winterfell and who might have led an Ironborn assault in a different version of events, was still at Winterfell, still a ward, still loyal in the way that proximity and time and the slow conversion of a hostage into a companion produced loyalty. The north had been defended from within, and the defense had held. Catelyn was at the gate. She did not run. Catelyn never ran. But she walked with a speed that was the equivalent of running, and her face was the face of a woman who had spent months receiving letters that were optimistic and silences that were terrifying, and who was seeing, finally, the reality that the letters had promised. Her husband, alive, on horseback, coming home. They did not speak at the gate. What they communicated was communicated through contact, hands, arms, the physical confirmation that letters could not provide. The words came later, inside, in the privacy of their chambers, where the politics and the strategy and the cost of the war could be discussed without the audience that gates and great halls imposed. Harrion Karstark is dead, Ned said. He gave the casualties without softening, the Stark way, the northern way, the method of a man who believed that honest pain was preferable to comfortable ignorance, and 1,000 others whose names I know, and 2,000 more whose names I should know and don't. You won. I survived. The Lannisters survived. The bastard sits the throne. Stannis broods on his rock. The realm goes on. Nobody won. You're alive. The children are safe. The North is intact. If that isn't winning, what is? Ned did not answer. The question was unanswerable. The answer was known, but it depended on which version of winning you measured against. If winning meant enforcing the law, Ned had failed. A bastard sat the throne. And the truth about Cersei's children was a document in a bank vault in Braavos rather than a fact that governed the realm. If winning meant protecting the North, Ned had succeeded. Winterfell stood. The Northern Lords were home. The borders were secure. If winning meant doing right, the answer was complicated by every compromise that Ned had made between the Ruby Ford and the peace that ended the war. The godswood was waiting. Ned went alone. The old habit, the northern devotion, the private communion between a man and his gods that was the closest thing to prayer that the old gods offered. The heart tree was as it always was, white bark, red leaves, the carved face that wept sap and that seemed, in certain lights and certain moods, to be watching. The face did not change. The face had not changed in 8,000 years. The world changed around it, and the face remained, and the constancy was the point. The reminder that the old gods endured while the men who worshipped them did not. He knelt. What did he pray for? Not victory. Victory had been achieved and found insufficient. Not justice. Justice had been compromised, and the compromise had been necessary. Not forgiveness. The gods forgave, or they didn't, and the old gods, unlike the Seven, did not negotiate their terms. He prayed, if prayer was the right word for what happened between a man and a weirwood tree in the ancient silence of a northern godswood, for clarity, for the ability to live with what he had done and what he had failed to do, for the understanding that a man could act with honor and still produce results that were imperfect, and that the imperfection was not a failure of the honor, but a feature of the world. Bran found him there, the boy, 10 now, walking with the cane that the fall from the tower and the long recovery had made necessary, came through the godswood with the careful steps of a child navigating uneven ground and the purposeful direction of a child who knew where his father would be. Father, Bran. The boy sat beside him. Not kneeling, sitting, his damaged legs stretched before him. his cane across his lap, his face turned toward the weirwood with an expression that was not devotion but attention, the close listening of a child who heard things in the silence that other people did not. "I dream of wolves," Bran said. "Every night, running, hunting, all of them. Grey Wind, Lady, Nymeria, Summer, Shaggy Dog, Ghost, all 6, running together through a forest that goes on forever. And sometimes I see through Summer's eyes. I see the world the way he sees it, the colors different, the sounds sharper, the smell of everything." He paused. "Is that normal?" Ned looked at his son. The question carried the weight of a child asking a parent whether something strange was also something frightening. And the answer required the honesty that Ned gave to all questions, and the gentleness that Bran's age demanded. The Starks have always had a bond with their wolves. The old stories say that the first men could walk in the skins of animals, that the connection between man and beast was a gift from the old gods, given to the people who kept faith with the weirwoods. Skin-changing, some call it that. Old Nan says skin changers were real. She told me they fought in the War for the Dawn, alongside the last hero, against the others. Old Nan says many things. Some of them are true. Bran was silent for a moment, his eyes Tully blue. Catelyn's eyes in Ned's face, fixed on the weirwood with the intensity of a child processing information that exceeded his experience, and that his instincts told him was important. "The dreams are getting stronger, Father. Not just wolves now. Trees. I dream of trees. Thousands of them. White trees with faces. All of them watching. All of them waiting." And behind them, in the cold, Bran stopped. The stopping was not dramatic. It was the natural stopping of a child who had reached the edge of what he could describe, and who sensed that the thing beyond the description was more than a child should articulate. "There's something coming," Bran said. "From the north. From beyond the wall. The trees know. The wolves know. I don't know how I know, but I do." Ned looked at his son, and the war that he had just fought, the war of thrones and succession and political alliance, receded into a context that was older and larger and more frightening than the ambitions of men. The Game of Thrones was a game played by mortals on a mortal stage. The thing that Bran was describing, the thing in the dreams, the thing behind the trees, the thing that the wolves sensed and the weirwoods watched and the old stories warned about, was not mortal. It was the threat that the wall had been built to contain, 8,000 years ago, by men who had faced it and survived, and who had poured everything they had into a barrier of ice and magic that stretched from coast to coast, and that was, if the stories were true, the only thing standing between the living and the dead. The war for the Iron Throne was over. The war for the living had not begun. Ned Stark had gone south to fight a war that could be won with swords. He had won it, imperfectly, incompletely, at a cost that exceeded the gain, and that taught him lessons about the limits of honor and the mechanics of power that he had not wanted to learn. He had brought his army home. He had brought himself home. He had done his duty. But duty, as Stannis had told him on Dragonstone, was a thing that did not end. It renewed. It demanded. It took the victories that men earned and converted them into obligations that men had not sought. And the obligation that was forming now, the obligation that Bran's dreams announced and that the old god's silence confirmed, was an obligation that made the war for the throne look like a border skirmish. Winter was coming. The Stark words, carved into the consciousness of a family that had governed the North for 8 millennia, were not a warning about the weather. They were a promise. The promise that the cold would return, that the long night would come again, that the thing in the north would wake and move south, and that the wall, ancient and enormous and crackling with magic that no one alive understood, would be the first and perhaps the last line of defense. Ned Stark had stayed in the north when Robert asked him to go south. He had stayed because his son was broken, and because his instincts told him that Winterfell was where he was needed. He had been right, not because staying had prevented disaster, but because staying had preserved the thing that mattered most: the North, the family, the wolves, the ancient compact between the Starks and the land they governed and the gods they worshipped and the wall they had built. He put his arm around his son. Bran leaned against him. The weirwood watched them with its red eyes, and the wind moved through the godswood, carrying the smell of autumn and the promise of winter. And the wolves, somewhere in the woods beyond Winterfell, running in a pack that had not existed before the direwolf mother had died on the King's Road, and that would not have existed if Ned had ridden south with Robert instead of staying to protect the children she had left behind. The wolves howled. 6 voices. One song, rising through the northern air toward a sky that was darkening with clouds that were not storm clouds, but winter clouds. The heavy, iron-grey ceiling that descended on the north when the season turned, and that would not lift for years. Ned Stark held his son and listened to the wolves and waited for winter. He had been waiting all his life.